may want to take seats in the front row and use.
I can do that. Good idea.
Yeah.
But you don't go away, Matt. Well, you can actually sit. You can wander around if you want to. Matt Brown, who's running off the dais here, will be our first speaker, and he has over 20 years worth of experience in the business sector, including founding companies, consulting for startups and Fortune 500s, and serving as president and C-level executive for prominent gaming, tech, and toy companies. In all of these areas, Matt's work emphasizes the science of play, using curiosity, imagination, creativity to solve problems, build empathy, and embrace change. One of his superpowers is applying the science of play to make our lives and world happier, healthier, and more harmonious. Richard Chosky has 35 years of experience in all facets of commercial real estate, from leasing projects to development. He has leased over 4 million square feet and managed 5 million square feet portfolios. He has also managed large construction projects in the Middle East. Richard has been the executive director of the Santa Fe Railyard Community Corporation since 2005. And our third speaker, Jamie Blosser, is an architect and the executive director of the Santa Fe Art Institute, whose mission is to cultivate creative leadership and invest in community culture and place to reimagine a more equitable world. She completed a Loeb Fellowship in 2015 at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and served as an AIA delegate for the UN Habitat 3 convening in Quito in October 2016. She was a director of the Santa Fe office of AOS Architects for 10 years. In her community design work with Okewinge led to the revitalization of their plaza area. She founded the Sustainable Native Communities Collaborative to support culturally appropriate and sustainable development in American Indian communities. She received her master's in architecture degree from the University of Pennsylvania. So what I'm on the H board, and so I spend a lot of time dealing with the downtown historic area of Santa Fe, and there are a lot of limits on what can be done there. And I think because of that, I'm acutely conscious of the fact that an enormous amount of growth is just simply not going to happen there. But we do want growth in our city. And I do believe that the Midtown Campus is our opportunity to, it is in the center of Santa Fe. It's in the geographical center, and it's also in really where the population center is. And I think that we can save our downtown, but still have a vibrant new center of the city. I think that this new center will be moving down south, and it's really, really important that we get it right. Matt is going to talk about, he's the Director of Economic Development at the city, and he's leading the city's planning effort, and he's going to bring us up to date on where that effort stands and what the next steps are. Richard will supply some history of the rail yards and how that project got implemented, another city-owned project, a city process that got it built, and he will give us some lessons learned that we will be able to apply to the Midtown Campus project. And finally, Jamie, who actually works on the Midtown Campus, will give her perspective and discussions of what vision, some of the visions of what that area can become. So, Matt, do you want to start out?
I'll start out. Yes. Hey, I am not Richard, even though it says up there. So, Matt here. Thanks for inviting me, Frank, to be a part of the panel. And actually, I can't wait to hear what Jamie and Richard have to say, but I'll try to get mine quick to everybody. For those who are not aware of the process that we've been going through for the Midtown property, we've broken that into a a three stages. So we call it the concepting stage, the planning stage, and the implementation. And all of this was generated and initiated by the departure of Laureate as the company that had signed a lease to provide higher education and manage the film studios and things like that. And they left in June. So as we knew that that was happening, the city council directed staff to figure out what we would do to redevelop the Midtown property. And I think you may have read about it. We certainly believe this to be true, that this is a once in a generation, if not a once in a lifetime of many generations opportunity to do something incredible for Santa Fe, with Santa Fe, for the future that could really direct and evolve us in a particular direction. Whatever we do there is going to affect the direction of the future of the city. So in that the initiation from City Council, we embarked on that first stage concepting that began in November of last year, the initial pre-planning. It really got ahead of steam in January and ultimately concluded in May. And during that whole process, we had numerous different ways in which we engaged with the community. Online, surveys, in-person events. Mary Shrubin, who I see over there, was one of the community leaders that helped us shape all of our work. And I want to tout out like the level of partnership we had with Mary and her team. She literally picked up surveys in English and Spanish and then hand them around to her community, and then we collected them back, so it was a real partnership. And Jamie as well, and what SFAI did to create an open forum where we invited people to come in. So I won't take you through all the steps of that, but it was an incredible amount of participation from our community. If you're interested to see all of the work that was done, as well as all of the prior research, we looked at about 8 years worth of different studies that had gone on in the city. They are all available on our website. So everything is in the spirit of transparent governance. You can see everything that we've done, including all the data that we collected and how we analyze that. But the conclusion of that work was a set of planning guidelines. And those planning guidelines were adopted unanimously by City Council. And in doing so, City Council also directed staff to move to the next stage, the planning stage, which we are embarking on or have embarked on now. I just got confirmation yesterday, which has been about a month in the waiting, that we will be having a project manager join my team here hopefully the next 2 weeks. So that's a critical next step, because we don't have the man and woman power to manage all the work that has to be done. So that's been a little bit of a delay on the progress, waiting to get this incredibly talented person on board. We did a whole RFP process. We found this person, and it's taken us about 3 months to get through all kind of bureaucratic paperwork. So welcome to the government. Yay! Yeah. Not always the fastest, but we're doing great work. And what is going to happen in the planning phase, there's two main threads of work to be done. One is through an RFP process is to ultimately select a partner or partners that will help us develop a land use development plan and framework for the property with phased development strategy, also looking at yield analysis, economic analysis, deep community engagement. So we continue to hear from the community what they want and how they're evaluating the work as we're progressing forward. And also getting expertise for financing and financial modeling for how to bring investment into the ultimate implementation of the framework that gets developed. The other path is what will be the governance model and governance structure for this. We'll hear from Richard, I assume in part, how the governance was set up for the Railyard. In this city, we also have the history of the governance that was set up, for example, with Tierra Contenta. So we have to look at how do we set one up for the Midtown property. So ultimately, as the implementation happens, it's happening underneath the governance model, whatever that will be. So that's the other big thread. My goal for the governance model is to have that concluded within 6 months. My goal for the planning is to have that completed by, I'd say, roughly next October, including going through the city council process. And I see one of our awesome city councilors there in the back, and a lawyer. Hello, lawyer. Hello, all lawyers. Yeah. You know I'm an ex-lawyer, right? Yeah, okay, good. So, I got to be economic development director. You can too. I think the other thing worth emphasizing in those in the strategic guideline or the planning guidelines, and I really appreciate Frank using the language from there. The high level concept is really a new city center. A being the operative word in there, not the new city center, but a new city center, and one that in doing that on the property, it catalyzes the whole concept that is represented in the Midtown Link, the local innovation corridor overlay that was approved by City Council a year and a half or so ago, which envisions the entire St. Mike's corridor from Cerrillos to St. Francis being completely revitalized, where we can imagine all those parking lots being converted over into multi-use business, residence, apartments, condos, with cafes spilling out onto wider pathways. So it's a much denser space, more of a pedestrian experience, and a place that we might all envision being a little. I always think about it staying up a little bit later than the rest of Santa Fe. And in that new city center concept or priorities that we heard from the community, there's really 4 main components to that. Number 1 is higher education, and it's really seeing us achieve the most premier, best higher education we've ever seen in Santa Fe, one that would attract national and international students, as well as serving all the students from Santa Fe, northern New Mexico who want to go there. And there's much more to be said about that, but that's number 1. And inside of there, just so you know, the work that we're doing, the strategy is really a consortium model. We don't have an expectation that one college or university will just do it, but what we believe is the most likely outcome is that there will be premier programs from premier schools that come together in an affiliation. And we're making some progress in conversations that I can't talk about the details, but that's the strategy and the approach that we're taking. Number 2 is expanding the film and media industry. We have the studios there. There's a vision for how to really expand those out from really just being sound stages into a mini studio. And there's a lot of enthusiasm for that and a lot of calls we're getting about that. So there's some interesting I believe some high confidence that we can achieve that. Number 3 is housing. First and foremost, if we achieve the higher education, we have to have housing for the student body. We did talk to one university, and they really emphasize this, like you want to have students on campus. You don't want to have them migrating out into neighborhoods, because that can really frustrate the people that live in those neighborhoods, because kids tend to be louder, if we all remember being 18 in college. So that's first and foremost. But second then are there opportunities either on the property or just adjacent to it to have affordable and workforce housing and high density, 2, 3, 4-story housing. And then number 4, excuse me, is retaining and amplifying the community spaces that are there, from the Greer Garson Theater to the Parkway, Sculpture Gardens, and things like that, so that the property itself is one that is being used by all residents, as well as the people that are either working or going to school on that property. So it's this very kind of urban campus idea, and there's visions. If you want to see, if you haven't seen them, I really encourage you to look at there were 5 different visuals created after, pardon? Oh, you're gonna talk about that. Yeah, Jamie's gonna do that, so, but go check them out, they're amazing. So that gives you at least the priorities that we got, and that then focuses all of our work of how we then will proceed with the planning. A sub-component to that, and last little bit, will be that as far as business goes, the business focus on the campus would be around entrepreneurship, new business, innovation, less about trying to put retail and things like that onto the property. We believe, and the community seem to believe, that that can go down the St. Mike's or Surrealist or elsewhere, but that the property itself, because if you have higher education and film and other kinds of those kinds of businesses, it's a natural extension of that to really look more at innovation and entrepreneurship, and also looking then at how do we bring Los Alamos and Sandia to be partners there. And yes, we're having preliminary discussions with them as well as with AFRL. And I think I got it. Is that good?
Excellent. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. You want that one? All right.
Okay.
Good afternoon. I'm Richard Chosky, Executive Director of the Santa Fe Railyard Community Corp., and I hope to give you a little context on the Railyard first, and then share some lessons learned from my 14 years of trying to finish the Railyard. You laugh. I signed up for a 2-year job, and I'm 14 years into it, so just to give you some context. Can you turn on there we go, thank you. So I'll get into some of the governance and those things as we go through the slides, but to give you an idea of the scope of the Railyard, 50 acres, which includes 13 acres covered by a conservation easement. Our development, when completed, will be about 550,000 square feet. We have 42 parcels, and we're 95% leased at this point. So who owns the Railyard? There's been a lot of confusion about that in terms of the individual buildings, etc. The model here is the city owns all the land and will continue to own the land. The land under the privately owned buildings, as well as the common areas, the plaza, etc. So we will have 32 privately owned buildings, all on ground leases. All the financing and ownership is set up so that the city's interest is superior to any of the financing or the private ownership of the buildings. This results in a very safe and conservative model where even if a building goes into foreclosure, like the building housing REI did for a couple of years, we continue to get our ground rent. So once a building is on a parcel, we are always going to get our ground rent, which is what we use to pay rent to the city, as you'll see. So it's about a $145 million project all in, equally split between the public and the private sector. The public sector money includes the parking garage, for example, under the Market Station, which was a $19 million project all on its own, the 400 space garage. Where are we financially? The $23 million the city paid to buy the land in 1995 was paid for in 2010, because when the city purchased the land, they put into effect a 1/16 of a cent gross receipts tax, which over that 10-year period, 15-year period, paid off the ground. So the next major expense was about $15 million for infrastructure. So those bonds were floated in 2006 and 2007. We managed and built all the roads, put all the utilities in, the storm sewer systems, parking, etc. And one of our missions is to repay all the debt that was incurred by the city for the infrastructure. So with interest and other carrying costs, it's just about $19 million. So we've paid 8 to date, and we have another 10 years to pay the balance. So you being attorneys, I thought you'd be interested in the governing documents, and they're comprised of the Railyard Master Plan, the Conservation Easement, Lease and Management Agreement between SFRCC and the city. That's SFRCC is our organization. And then leases between us and our tenants who build the individual buildings. So the master plan was 7 years in the making. I wasn't involved in those days, but it was an extensive outreach program wherein people went to the churches, the schools, and had an extraordinary amount of input from over 6,000 people. And those results are documented through written surveys as well as phone surveys. So roughly 10% of the population of Santa Fe in those days weighed in on what they wanted on this project. The master plan itself is not an ordinance, it's a resolution, and it was approved by City Council. And it's been amended 13 times. Any amendment of the master plan has to be approved by City Council. The conservation easement was key to the acquisition of the rail yard because through a tax credit situation, the Trust for Public Land helped reduce the purchase price for the city when they bought the land. Of course, it's a perpetual easement. It's has a huge number of rights, obligations, restrictive covenants. It covers the park, the plaza, the tracks, so kind of a swath through the middle of the project. It was looked at recently, amended and restated, basically when the easement was transferred from the Trust for Public Land to the Santa Fe Conservation Trust. We took an opportunity at that point to update it. So there's a lot of confusion in that folks think that we're the city or that the city pays us to manage and develop the rail yard, when in fact the relationship is a lease agreement. We master lease the rail yard from the city, and our lease includes some unusual and extraordinary responsibilities for development and management that you wouldn't typically put on your tenant. So we do project entitlement. We help get projects through Planning Commission and City Council when required. We managed the construction of the infrastructure, as I said, and we continue to do construction as funding is available. We do the leasing of the ground leases, some property management, although most of the rail yard is maintained by the city. And then we also have a very active role in the events and public use of the park, the plaza, all the concerts that go on, everything that happens in the public realm on the rail yard, we permit and we manage. And that over time, that's become a much more important and critical part of what we do as we try to build the, reinforce the fact that the rail yard is community owned for the most part. So where do we get our income? 100% of our income is the result of the ground leases and the event management fees. So the city does not fund our operations. We are financially self-sustaining. So the next group of agreements are our lease agreements with our tenants. So they tend to be ground leases, although a few of them include the building. For example, where El Museo is located and Firebox, Santa Fe Clay, that's a building lease, but for the most part, they're ground leases. They have a 90-year term, because if you're going to build a building and invest your capital, you want as long a lease as possible. They typically increase annually by the CPI, and the dirt gets reappraised every 10 years. That's so the citizens of Santa Fe continue to maintain their level of equity in the ground, and in fact, it increases over time. The tenants are free to sell their building, and then the ground lease would be assigned to the buyer. So one of the things that is unusual is that any of the subtenants that go into our tenants' buildings, even though we don't own them, are approved by us. And the Railyard Master Plan has leasing criteria that has a few tranches, but in a nutshell, it gives preference to local businesses. We've varied from that occasionally. REI is obviously not a local business, but we do have the discretion to do that when necessary. Again, all the financing is subordinate to the city's fee interest in the ground. And when when our agreement expires or is terminated, the city will become the landlord. So all the leases will return back to the city. So what makes this project different? The extensive community-based project planning. I hope yours doesn't take 7 years, Matt, but ours did. Land leases, so we lease the land instead of selling the land. And that was for 2 reasons, because we wanted to encourage local business, and if you lease the ground, you don't have to come up with 25 or 30 or 40% down payment to finance the ground to purchase it. So it was intended to lower the barriers of entry for local businesses. And remember, this is pretty expensive dirt, being where it's located. The other reason we'll go into a bit was for us to maintain more control over what happens in the future on the rail yard. The prior developer who the city purchased the ground from wanted to rip up all the rails and take those out because they weren't making any money on that. We wanted to keep those, and we're eventually blessed with the rail runner. It's not a highest and best use project. So highest and best use would result in a project that looks like Albuquerque Uptown. It's a great project, it's very successful, but that's not what the rail yard was ever meant to be. It was never meant to be a shopping center. It was never meant to be nothing but retail and national retailers. In fact, over 100,000 square feet of buildings in the rail yard are occupied by 4 nonprofits who enjoy basically subsidized ground rent, because we wanted to keep the fabric of the project to be diverse and it not become a shopping center. Although we have nothing against retail, but that wasn't the goal here. And then talking about governance, we're a standalone 501c3 nonprofit. We have a significant amount of independence and discretion that's baked into our lease agreement with the city. One of the key elements here is that the rail yard was, by virtue of our role, we've depoliticized the rail yard, which, depending on your point of view, may be good or may be bad. Nonetheless, we have a lot of discretion and autonomy in how the rail yard was built and how it's continued to be operated. Also, the conservation easement, when you that's something a private sector developer would never do, is take 30% of your land and make it a park. So, the lessons learned, I want to stress, are my personal opinions, not the opinion of Santa Fe Rail Yard Community Corp or their board. These are my observations as I think about the task in front of Matt and the city for their project. I can only say how things were in my experience. So I think you have to accept, and sometimes it's difficult, that not everyone's going to be happy. And there are different stages when they're unhappy and different stages when they're happy. So us being an independent entity, we are able to absorb the political blows in a different manner than the elected officials at the city would be. Don't be too aggressive with social engineering. And the example I use is that the rail yard was, to a great extent, intended to be a pedestrian-friendly environment, and one which encouraged bicycle and public transportation to access it, and walking from the neighborhoods. And we certainly encourage that, but just because we built the rail yard that way, and we said that in the master plan, didn't mean that everybody stopped driving to the rail yard. So even though we have 900 parking spaces, sometimes people get frustrated. It's just like coming downtown. Sometimes it's difficult to find a parking space, but there's a lot of pressure in the community planning process to social engineer and embrace platonic concepts, but I would just encourage a level of pragmatism to be overlaid with those good intentions, because the parking is a good example. So this is one some people in the room may not like, but when I started, it was very difficult to attract the private sector to invest in the rail yard, because they said, look, you're just the city, we can't rely on you, things will change as the political winds change, and if I'm going to invest $2 million in a building, you know, I can't do it if I don't have some certainty in the future. And I don't want my competitor to be able to go to city council and get something done to amend the master plan or the changes. I want the master plan to be in place so I know what's going to happen in the future. So if I'm investing in a high-end gallery, I know that if 5 years later, if the parcel next to me doesn't get leased, somebody's not going to build a water park or something. I mean, you have to be open to a certain amount of change over time, but the private sector does desire some consistency and ability to know what's going to happen in the future. My other observation goes along with the governance question, is that I have found that because we have a binding document with the city that now will eventually be almost 20 years term, those agreements, the rights and obligations of both parties stay in place and are not subject to amendment unless both parties want to amend them. So over time, it's cut both ways. It's benefited the city, and sometimes it benefits us sometimes. But I think if you have a statutory situation that can be amended by the government, it is subject to change, and your basic business plan could be subject to revision. So we fall back to those documents that I discussed earlier that we have to live by. And then also for the future is, in the master plan, describe what items would have to go through the political process to change and which ones are fixed. And the Railyard master plan, the drafters of that did a great job in doing that. So somebody knows what can be changed, but also what's going to be consistent. We are now on mayor number 5 and dozens of city councilors since we started the project. And the consistency of the documents in place have allowed us to be consistent with the project. And this may not be a popular observation either, but as administrations change, goals and objectives change, there's sometimes a desire to reinvent the wheel, and sometimes it needs to be reinvented, but I think in this case, we've been able to stick with the master plan because it's outside of the ability of administrations to influence it. The financial return criteria, if you're in the private sector, it's 5 years. You want to do your deal in 5 years and you want to be gone to the next one. Well, we're now, since 1995, we have substantially more time. We, the citizens in the city and us, invested in this project. The financial situation would never work for a private sector developer to do this project. The fact that we hit a major recession in 2007, we are at exactly the same leasing that we were in 2007 today. So it took us more than 10 years to recapture what we lost in the recession because so many tenants and developers pulled out at that point because they couldn't get financing. So you have to be able to, the next one, have a fallback plan to service the debt. And There were years we couldn't make the debt service on the bonds, so we had to go back to the city and get deferrals to push those payments out into the future. A private sector developer would have, in that situation, would have just lost the project. It would have gone back to the lenders. So that's not what anybody wanted, but that was the outcome. So that's the good, the bad, and the ugly, I guess. So I guess we'll respond to questions at the end. Thank you. Do you know how to queue up your PDF? Okay.
So I'm Jamie. I moved to Santa Fe in '96, and it was right when the community days were starting. So I remember that whole process. It was a very inclusive process, and I thought it was pretty fantastic. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. So I thought it would be helpful to also just briefly talk about the Art Institute so that you can understand what I'm doing standing up here in the midst of this conversation. And I want to start first with an acknowledgement, and this is what we have started doing over the last year and a half, is to really pause for a moment and acknowledge the lands that we are on as being traditional lands of the Tewa and Tanos peoples. And for those of you who are not here in Santa Fe, there's a really fantastic website called nativeland.ca, and it shows you where you are. You can just type in an address anywhere, and it shows you what those traditional territories are where you live. I won't go through the mission because thank you, Frank, for saying that. But much of what we do at the Art Institute focuses on thematic programming. We focus around art seeking to impact social issues, and so we have an annual theme every year that's relevant locally, but also nationally and internationally. Right now, our theme is Truth and Reconciliation. And we bring in over 70 artists from around the world, but also nationally and locally, to focus on that theme every year. We also have fellowship programs. We're just finishing our inaugural Story Maps Fellowship, which is in partnership with city departments, Matt Brown and the Economic Development Office being one of them. So that's been a 10-month fellowship that we're finishing up. We also do monthly and annual events as well. And we have been on the campus since '98. And that was as a result of a pretty long-ranging vision by the College of Santa Fe, the Art Institute leadership at that time, and the largesse and generosity of people like John and Ann Marion and Don Tishman, who really thought about what an arts and education center would be in Santa Fe to benefit our local community and our entire northern New Mexico community. And so not only did we get this gorgeous building designed by Ricardo Legorreta, but we also got the entire Visual Arts Center. So there's 3 other buildings that are on the campus that are not run by the Art Institute, but are part of the city property that we're talking about in the Midtown Campus. And all of these buildings are just absolutely gorgeous and provide a really interesting contemporary architectural typology that you don't see much in Santa Fe. And so I'll show you where we are on the campus. So the blue area is sort of the outline of what we're talking about. It's 60 acres, and we are right here in that corner. This is St. Michael's Drive, and this is Cerrillos Road. And this is state land. That's why it's not in blue. It's actually all been demolished. Those used to be Army barracks. And the Army barracks used to go all the way from Cerrillos down to Siringo. And so I think it's really important to consider what this place has been over the years. There's a lot of nostalgia in Santa Fe for this as a campus. It's been a campus since the mid-1800s and various forms. And I'm very grateful to my leadership in 2009. I've been at the Art Institute for 3 years. I'm very grateful in 2009 when the College of Santa Fe closed and Laureate stepped in to start the University of Art and Design. My leadership at the Art Institute negotiated a lease with the city that carved us out of that, but at the same time really continued that partnership with what was then the Santa Fe University of Art and Design. And so through the years, there's always been that very important partnership that we've been grateful for, and now we're really seeking to have fantastic neighbors because it's been a very nice reciprocal partnership. And one thing that I and my board are very much seeking is not just to maintain that legacy of arts and education on the campus, but to strengthen it. And so we're reaching out to local and regional arts and educational organizations that would be willing to explore concepts about being on the property with the city as well. And that's part of what's been in those planning guidelines. And so when Matt and Councilor Harris asked me if I wanted to participate in this spring planning conceptual phase that they were undertaking, I said, of course. And it doesn't hurt that I'm an architect and know how to write RFPs. And so we helped to shepherd the architect's visioning phase that I'm going to go through a little bit right now, just to sort of show you what I think visually some of the ideas are and some of our local talent can provide as this project moves forward. But just to be very clear, this was never meant to be a plan to move forward in detail. We asked the architects, all of them, to be very visionary and think big picture, and you'll see that many of them did. And so one of them, surroundings, they really took it, they're a planning firm and a landscape architecture firm. They took it from a very broad perspective, which was looking at all of Midtown as an eco-district and starting to put the sustainable Santa Fe ideas and plans and ordinances into effect into this property by really developing Midtown as a model for what an eco-district could look like. And then really looking at what's existing and what's potential. You'll see in all of what I'm about to show that every single one of these visions really tackled this concept of connectivity. And I personally think, being on the campus, operating day by day, that it is much too cloistered and it's become more and more walled off through the years. And that, in fact, I believe, as an architect and planner, has contributed to disinvestment and sprawl in Midtown. And I think that there's significant opportunities, and in fact, we'll seek further investment and attract further investment with those connections that I know the city is looking at. So connecting possibly to Cerritos, connecting down through the campus to the park on Camino Carlos Rey. This proposal by Strata Design, I think, was really brilliant for the fact that they were really thinking about this as a process. They knew that this was just, we gave everyone $5,000 stipends, not very much, but enough to sort of tackle some of these original concepts. But they really saw it as a process. And I think that that was sort of the beauty of what they proposed, because they really saw that this, as you've seen with Richard, this is a long-term project. This may get started soon, but it may take 10 or 15 years or more to really build out. And so they were looking at short-term activation, and they used the whole concept of the watershed, which of course we're very cognizant of here in Santa Fe, to promote their work, and how you activate it, but also how you allow some things to develop immediately, and then see whether those baby steps can then grow into larger projects. And then you really start to develop those further with those small successes in the short term. This was a project that, instead of going up, they really proposed that the entire property was very dense, but not, you can see how the surrounding property is not very dense at all, and that this is all footprint, everything but the green and the roadways. And so they were really taking the Legareta design, the contemporary Mexican design, to its sort of extreme, I would say. And so really looking at how an architectural style and sort of just sticking with 2-story, maybe some 3-story buildings, but not going higher than that, and higher density could impact what that property looks like. This is a very architectural approach as opposed to a planning approach, I would say. And then many of them really broadened out and recognized that this property really can be a model for development of the entire Midtown area. Just a few years ago, the Midtown Link Overlay District was created, and many of them started to think about how this property could reflect the very, very different zoning model that the Midtown Link proposes, and also go beyond the property. So this particular proposal, this is the property right here, and they're proposing to really think about how the entire area is developed with higher density. And so this is the shape of the entire Midtown Link district, and you can see that the campus is a large part of that, but it also goes well beyond the campus, and I believe it goes even further down St. Michael's Drive. And so then they did sort of just a 3D rendering of what that would look like. This is Cerrillos, and this is St. Michael's Drive. Again, this is the campus right here, and we're back here in that corner. And you can just imagine when we went to the community forums, this is basically what the Midtown Link Overlay District allows. It allows 4 stories on the campus up to 5, but it was not well received necessarily, I would say, by most Santa Feans who are not used to that kind of height and density. But I think it's very important to put out there, and it's very important, of course, to continue having these conversations around density and what we need to do to really address infill so that we don't continue to sprawl south and west. These are large files, so I think sometimes they get a little stuck. Thank you. You're welcome. Well, doesn't quite want to do it. I just wanted to show this one. I guess I'll stay here and I'll see where it actually goes. Okay. Woo! I'm going to pretend that it's doing what I want it to do. So this next proposal, it's the 5th one out of 5, really took an area on St. Michael's Drive. I'm just going to stay here right now. I'm just going to stay here. And proposed to completely shift how we think about St. Michael's Drive and create a brand new entry into the campus and a gateway into the campus as well. And so I think this is interesting because one of the big questions, and it plagues the Midtown Link Overlay District, is that St. Michael's Drive is still owned by the state. And so it's incredibly difficult until there's any kind of land swap or other for St. Michael's Drive to have any kind of traffic calming rather than being a highway arterial road. But that's something that some of the architects really did address. And so I'm going to stop there. I just want to pause and say I think that these are really great proposals. Very, very, very preliminary. We did not ask anyone to look at feasibility or cost or budget. But that's exactly what Matt and his team are going to move forward with, which is very exciting. And I will say that we continue to partner with the city when we can, really want to continue the conversation. We were able to secure a grant from the Loeb Fellowship at Harvard to bring people from all over the country who are experts in development and real estate and planning to provide recommendations to the city regarding governance and planning and economic analysis. And so it's been a very fun few months, and we really look forward to what this will become. I agree that with Matt that this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. And here we are on the campus sort of looking forward to what that is and partnering with that next step. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. We have time for some questions, and I have a first question for Matt. Given Richard's sort of description of the governance of the Railyard, do you have any sense of what the structure is likely to be of the Midtown Campus?
specific answer, no, we don't have, there's no design yet for that. With that caveat or preamble, I guess, what we do want to do is learn and take what worked best at the Railyard, what worked best at Tierra Contenta, what didn't work as well as either one of those, and make sure that the model that we set up going forward is built off of the lessons of the past. So I can say that level of kind of analysis and intelligence will inform what we do, but we're not at a place yet where we have made a decision of what that actual structure will be. And if I could just build off of one thing that Jamie indicated around because I heard the laughter with the 4-story high around St. Mike's and Cerrillos. It's true that as those were first being shown, there was, I think, initial more negative than positive reaction, but as those got shown into different groups, a new conversation happened, which was asking the residents or pointing out to the residents that what they are experiencing in Santa Fe and have for quite a while now is sprawl. Right? So we have lots of 1-story and maybe 2-story buildings just spreading out across a city. And once that was brought up, a different kind of conversation had, because then the really conversation is, which do you want? Right? Do you want to keep spreading out thin, or do you not want to have that? And the antidote to not spreading out is to have density. And once that conversation happened, we start to see a lot more positive response to the concept. It wasn't necessarily like, hey, let's make sure we have 4 stories everywhere, but we did see a lot more positive reaction and support for density coming in to the Midtown link, and that would be something that would be important, valuable, and valued. And also it's reflective of even where we sit today, right? Like in this space and in our surrounding area is a relatively high density spot for Santa Fe. And I think a lot of people started to reflect on that and trying to find that in the Midtown link. So I just want to layer that in.
Thank you. So questions? Anyone have a question? Wait for the microphone.
If you can speak to the mic,
Thanks.
then we can catch it.
Could you give just a capsule of the relationship between the entities, the Art Institute and the rest of the property, how they relate, who's in control of whom?
Yeah. Jamie said I'm in charge. I think City Council's in charge. So, to be very explicit, the city owns the campus, the property, the 64.5 acres. And buildings. We own and in fact all the stuff inside those buildings. So we own everything. The SFAI exists outside of the campus. It looks like it's on the campus, but as Jamie pointed out, it's actually not inside the boundaries of the campus. So that is a long-term lease. Is that with the city also? So it's a long-term lease with the city. So albeit we own it, SFAI is the tenant and have a long-term lease on it. And that's our relationship with the property. So everyone who's a resident, you own it, right?
Richard, what's the latest status on the Flying Star space?
So that building, you may know, went through a bankruptcy procedure, and in fact, in a foreclosure right after that. I'll give you a little bit of history. Flying Star left that space because Flying Star got involved in real estate development in Bernalillo. And Flying Star, like a lot of people in the mid-2005 area, thought you could get into everybody can get rich in real estate, and it's really easy, and let's do it. So that led to the bankruptcy of Flying Star in all of their entire company. So there was that fact. The other fact was they had a huge balloon payment due to the owner of that building for tenant improvements, And coincidentally, a couple of weeks before that was due, they left the space. So, by way of background. Now, going forward, the lender got the building back in February and has hired a leasing agent and done some improvements on the building, and they're actively looking for a tenant. But the Railyard master plan and our board of directors is encouraging them and requiring them to find a local restaurant to go into that space, because we focus on local businesses and local tenants. Well, that's about a 9,000 square foot space, which is very large for a restaurant. Now, the owners may be willing to subdivide it, and I believe they are, but they're in the leasing process right now, and that's what's going on with that space.
Do we have more questions? Dan?
So how are we going to take care of the university campus during the decade or so it takes to decide what we're going to do with it? And all the stuff inside it.
Okay, a couple of things. First is, like right immediately, for example, we hired 2 weeks ago a security company to provide nighttime security throughout the campus. So we have to continue to invest in that until such time that someone else has that responsibility. So there's a commitment today and there's a commitment in the future to ensure that there's security presence on the property. In the past, Laureate was providing that as an example as the lessee of the property. Number two is that we have already inventoried. We got a preliminary inventory done before Laureate left of all of the personal property. We are doing a supplementary inventory analysis. We've concluded that on the music studio. We are about to do that at the Greer Garson Theater, and we continue to do that through other buildings that have notable property. We've also secured all the artwork on the property. On the artwork side itself, we've also initiated a lending program. So we're pulling artwork that's in a secured vaults and laying them out into public and foundation and nonprofit organizations around the city. So they're actually, now the public gets to see them. They're not locked into vaults. And then as we move forward, and then then there's active parts of the campus right now. So the Greer Garson studios continue to be rented out on an ongoing basis. So in those instances, we actually have tenants, and they are doing a good job of utilizing the property, and we make sure that we review what they're doing, and that if they leave it in good shape. If they don't, we charge them for any issues that they raise. And then this past summer, and we'll do it again, we've been working on temporary programming. So we had Southlight Summer, for example. We had films, outdoor films happening on the campus this summer a couple times. And so the broad concept is to keep it activated. So find different tenants, whether they're short-term or medium-term, to be utilized as much of the space as possible, because the more it's being used, the more it's populated, the safer, the more secure it is. We also have hired at different times organizations. In one case, I forget the name of it, but it was an organization that helps people experiencing homelessness transition out to come onto the property and maintain the grounds. Because some people get upset that there's weeds there, so we don't have enough people in the park staff to do it all. So we hired this company, and it was great. It was awesome. They did a fantastic job. And then a 10 years, sure, it may take 10 years to finish it, but it's not going to take 10 years to start it. And as the vendor or vendors or partners, whoever it is, come on to start implementing the plans, as they do that, the site will start to fill in and become more occupied and more utilized. And that's beyond taking care of it. That's actually transitioning it from the place it is now to the most vibrant Midtown property and space that we've ever had there. So hopefully that answers most of the question. I'm happy to take a follow-on to it, but that's what we're on from today into the future.
I'll just ask one quick question,
Sure.
if I may. Has there been any consideration given to following the Railyard model of turning it over to a a third party to manage it, whether it's for or not for profit?
That would be one of the considerations for the governance model. But as I said earlier, there's no decision made on that. So over the next, my goal, our goal, is to conclude that within the next 6 months. But first we have to do our due diligence and not only looking at what we've done here, but also look at best practices in other cities and communities and municipalities around the U.S. so that we have done from my vantage point and the team's vantage point, all of our due diligence to make the best choice possible for what that governance will be. And it also implies who the partners are and who the vendors are. So there's multi-facets to making that decision.
I'd like to underline one of the things that Matt said, that this is not the city center or not the future city center, but a city center. And I think that Santa Fe is very lucky in looking at Albuquerque, and you have Old Town, sort of the old historic buildings, and maybe analogous to our downtown area. But if you think of Albuquerque, I mean, that's just this little tourist area. But in Santa Fe, our downtown has the state government and the city government, museums, a really live area, and I think it will remain a significant part of Santa Fe. But the Midtown campus will allow, again, for the density that we can't have downtown and for a vibrancy that, okay, so people will be up after 9 o'clock, someplace in town. It'll be probably pretty good. Yeah. For those young guys who can still do that.
It doesn't have to be us. We shouldn't be there. Leave the young people alone.
That is all the time we have, and we don't have a break for the next panel, and I see our next panelists back there. So I'd like to say thank you to our panel. I'll just ask Christina, but I think not. Christina, you're not doing any PowerPoint, are you? No PowerPoint. Bill Sleet's the last one for the day is. I'll look you up. I'd be very interested to find out some of the history, because it's ancient history for me. I worked on it from 95 to 98 or 2000. And
I was just going to introduce them and then let them talk.
Yep.
All right, everyone, we'll get started. My name is Christina Martinez. I am a member of the Neighborhood Law Center, and I am here to introduce two guys who need no introduction, really. But we thought that because we have a session starting in January 15th at noon, and it's a 60-day session, and we have a new governor and a bunch of new people in our legislature, that we should have Senator Peter Wirth, who is the majority floor leader of the House Senate, and Speaker of the House Brian Egolf, give us a preview of what we can expect into the 2019 legislative session, what we are going to see, what we're going to get done. And yeah, I turn it over to Brian and Peter.
Thank you. Christina Martinez, the best law partner in Santa Fe. So Peter and I were visiting, Senator Wirth and I were visiting before coming over about how we wanted to use the time that we have this afternoon. And we have done this a lot. And we're sort of joking, this is the Peter and Brian show. And we thought we would hit on a few topics and kind of go back and forth. And then I think we want to leave a little time at the end for questions. Okay. We have an hour, right? Okay. So I thought I'd talk about education, and then Peter's going to talk about tax reform. I'll talk a little bit about healthcare and insurance, and then Peter has some process things to discuss, and then we'll open it up to questions. And so to start, there is a very, very different landscape for the legislature and the executive branch starting in January than we have right now. So right now, several of New Mexico's statewide elected officials are members of the Republican Party. In the House of Representatives, our margin is 38 Democrats to 32 Republicans. The Senate is 26-16. And come January, we will have every statewide elected office occupied by a Democrat, and our margin in the House has gone from 38-32 to 46-24. It's the largest majority for a party in the House since 1994, and we've, of course, elected Michelle Lujan Grisham. So we're one of a few states in the country that has what's called a Democratic trifecta. We have both chambers in the legislature, as well as the governor's office. We had, incidentally, you should all be pleased on a purely nonpartisan basis, because turnout in this election nationally was the highest in percentage terms for a midterm since 1914. So that's national number. And in New Mexico, we hit over 54% turnout. A little more than 701,000 people cast ballots in the election, which is a huge number for a midterm. So now the Democrats are kind of done high-fiving, and now we have to actually start producing results for the people that elected us. We really feel like we're coming in with a mandate and want to make up for a lot of the lost time that we've had over the last 8 years. This is combined, the shifting political landscape, in my view, is made even a little more interesting because New Mexico is the only major oil producing state in the country with a Democratic government. New Mexico this year became the third largest producer of crude oil in the United States. We may become number 2 in the country next year after Texas. So we produce more oil here than Alaska, and we just passed California. So now it's Texas, North Dakota, and New Mexico. What this means is that a budget situation that the last time Senator Wirth and I spoke, we were talking about budget reductions of 5-6%, running reserves, if we were lucky, of 0.5 percentage point. We were cutting budgets for higher education, stagnant K-12 budgets, if not reduced, if you take into what's called below-the-line spending. And we had an executive that would not allow any change on the revenue picture. So we were having to meet our constitutional duty to balance the budget by spending less and reducing the size of government. I think there's something right now like 9,000 vacancies in state government, something like that. And that's because there's been almost a total hiring freeze for 8 years. So there's a lot that's coming different, because we could see reserves in the next budget as high as 40%, a budget surplus that was projected at $1.2 billion. I've said don't be surprised if it's $2.4 billion or more, and this is in a budget that is $6.3 billion. So these are massive numbers. And the question is, what are we going to do with the money? Well, we're going to make a lot of one-time investments in roads and infrastructure, but also some of this money is going to be considered recurring, meaning we can put that money into hiring and into programs that need funding year after year after year. So we started talking during the campaign about an education moonshot for New Mexico. And I was very pleased when Governor-elect Lujan Grisham on the campaign trail stole the idea, stole the name from us, and I said, that's great, take it and run with it. And so we have now the Yazzie Martinez lawsuit that Judge Singleton issued an order in that describes New Mexico's education system accurately and very depressingly, and points out all the areas in which we are failing to meet our constitutional obligation to provide a sufficient education. Whether it be at-risk students, English language learners, Indian language learners, or other categories of students across the state, they are not being served and not receiving the education that they deserve, but also are required to receive by our Constitution. So there's going to be a variety of policy changes that we will consider in the upcoming session, changing things like the at-risk formula, which helps state money follow the students that need it the most. For those who don't know, New Mexico is one of the first, if not the first state in the country to adopt what's called an equalization guarantee, which means the money follows the student per pupil. And the money goes in at the state level and then follows this overly complicated formula out to the school districts who get money based on the student populations that they serve. But over time, we have modified that so that districts with higher percentages of at-risk or districts where there is a greater mobility of students or a higher percentage of English language learners, they can get supplements to those funds. So as we look at the needs in terms of dollars, we're looking at the possibility that 4 to 5 years from now, we could be spending as much as $1 billion more every year on a recurring basis on K-12 education. That would be about a 50% increase. On top of that, we are hoping to get as close as we can to about $250 million dedicated to early childhood education. We're going to look at making investments in our teacher colleges so that 3-4 years from now, students will be graduating ready to go into a classroom and start teaching. There's the possibility that we'll need to hire as many as 10,000 teachers over the next 4 to 5 years in New Mexico, which is an epic, monumental change in how we approach education. And while we do that, we are going to be giving pay raises to our existing teachers that under certain circumstances, if we expand what's called K3+, K3+ is a program that says for kindergarten through 3rd grade, the school year is extended at the back end and starts earlier on the front end. We are looking at taking that from K3+ to K5+, so kids through the end of 5th grade would have longer school years, which is good often for parents. It's also great for the kids and the teachers because of the pay increase that goes along with that. So under certain circumstances, teachers that we have right now could see pay increase as much as 20% over a 1-year period. Now these are all sort of, I think, ceiling numbers, and we have to go through the committee process. And that's the last piece here that I'll mention before I ask Peter to take the mic, and that is we have lots of input coming from lots of different areas on how to get the state into compliance with the order from Judge Singleton. And we have an interim legislative education study committee that has been doing a lot of work. We're receiving input from a lot of different groups, and then we'll be into the legislature where the committees will be making the final decisions. We've decided, Senator Worth and I, along with our respective chambers, we've decided that we have to let the committee process work its course so that members of the public can see the conversations in committee, so that members of the public can appear and offer their comments about different pieces of legislation and different funding mechanisms. We're talking back and forth about the possibility of having 1 or 2 omnibus education packages that would each have pieces that would address the big features of the lawsuit. And then we'll go back to, or the parties to the lawsuit will go back to Judge Singleton in April, and she will decide whether or not the legislature is making enough progress on addressing the insufficiencies in education. I can't say today how much we're going to increase K-12 education funding in the next fiscal year, but it will be substantial. I don't think I'm going too far out on a limb to say it's going to be the largest single-year increase in K-12 education in the history of the state. But when it comes to actual specific dollars, we'll have to wait and see what happens. So this idea that we're going to really put our shoulders to the wheel and try to keep New Mexico from bouncing 50, 49, 48 down to 50, we need to make this kind of massive investment in early childhood and in K-12 in order to give New Mexico a chance to go from 50 to 25 or higher. And it's got to be the main commitment of the legislature and the next governor to put education at the top of the list. Because of these huge surpluses, we really do have an opportunity to give a chance to a generation of New Mexico's kids to be lifted out of poverty and to be given an opportunity at a real, productive, healthy, and safe future. So the stars have aligned with the new elected officials that are coming in, budget surpluses, the Azzy Martinez decision, and I know I speak for Senator Worth when I say that this is something that the House and the Senate are very much focused on addressing early in the session, and we hope to get a great result out for the folks around the state. So that's a broad overview of education. I know we have Q&A in a minute, so I'll stop there and pass it off to Senator Worth.
Great, thank you, Brian. Hi, everyone. It's good to see you all. Again, it's interesting wearing two hats in life as a lawyer and as a legislator, and I've dealt with many of you wearing each hat, and so it's always good to catch up on what's happening in our world. I think the last time we were here, we were talking vetoes and constitutional lawsuits, and we were in full-blown crisis, and it just was an all-out fight. It's been a brutal decade. And really for the last 8 years, and the 2 years prior as well, where there wasn't any money coming in, but the last 8 years, we've been, from my perspective, fighting for the status quo, and that was a win. And that is a horrible place to be in a state that has so many needs as we do. I want to just give you a sense of how dramatically things have changed. I see Representative Matthew McQueen in the back. He wears two hats as well. He chairs the Energy Natural Resources Committee in the House, and for 2 years his committee makeup was 6-6, which basically means nothing moves unless everybody agrees. And so now I think those numbers, 8-4 I'm hearing. I was trying to go for 9-3, but the speaker's saying 8-4. It shows you how significantly things have changed. The other thing I can't stress enough, to have a governor that wants to work with the legislature, who knows us. She's been in state government for a long time. We had a meeting with leadership last week, D's and R's, both chambers, and I just walked out of there excited, bouncing off the wall. And it wasn't just the Democrats. One of my Republican colleagues said, I feel like I just spoke to a governor for more in the last hour than I have in the last 8 years. There really was not an effort to work with the legislature, get us into a room, deal with these tough issues, don't get into this partisan stuff. I think we have a governor that wants to do that. And so Brian is right. The window of opportunity here is extraordinary given what's happening with the finances and what's happening in energy in our state. Obviously, the oil and gas piece is a huge part of it, but I just want to repeat something that Doug Howe said at a seminar I was at last week. Our renewable energy economic potential production is more than 160 times the state's electricity consumption today. More than 160 times wind and solar. We have this extraordinary resource, and we've got a governor that wants to go that direction. And so you give us the resources to be able to finally start doing all the backfilling and begin to look proactively moving forward, and it is super, super exciting. A couple of things that you all will be interested in, you should know about. If you were one of many folks that were advocating for bills the last couple of years that were passed unanimously or with just a couple votes in opposition and then vetoed, and there are massive numbers of these bills, we have agreed, working, Brian and I, talking to the governor-elect, we're going to try something a little different with those bills. Since the legislature did all the work on those bills, seems crazy that they all get in the way of all the other things we need to do, so we're going to do something we've been calling a rocket docket. And literally those bills will go through a consent committee, and assuming everyone's still on board, they'll get a single referral in each chamber. We'll probably bring them to the floor the second week, send the bills to the other side, and then we're going to send a bunch of bills up to the governor-elect. And she's anxious to do this, and I just think it's a step to show that both sides, these are D and R bills that were vetoed, that passed many with no votes in opposition. I think is a big step forward. That's going to be a priority, and you're going to see that happen. Another priority on the Senate side, and then I'll talk about the tax piece. Another big priority, regents. You know, we've got to get confirmation of regents down at our universities. That's something that has been incredibly challenging and problematic. And I think you're going to see the governor-elect working with Senator Lopez and the Rules Committee. That's a Senate process that does confirmations. Having those regent confirmations early on is something that I am certainly interested in. I know the governor-elect is as well. I won't repeat that.
I said so as a UNM men's soccer team.
So, no, it's all good. We also desperately need to do tax reform in this state. We've spent 40+ years carving out exemptions, deductions, loopholes. Every company that comes in goes and hires a good lobbyist and got their exemption. We used to do these Christmas tree bills when I was first in the House. Back in the Richardson days, we'd roll out a $100 million package of just, exemption after exemption after exemption. And then Majority Leader in the House, Kenny Martinez, was the one that started to raise the red flag and say, this is going to come back to haunt us. And it has. We have dramatically narrowed our tax base, and we've got rates that are way too high. And the gross receipts tax, which is a huge piece of our budget, desperately needs to be lowered and that base broadened. So, we spent a lot of time talking about tax reform with Governor Martinez, but the problem is Governor Martinez signed Grover Norquist's pledge to never raise any taxes. And it's pretty hard to do tax reform when you can't reallocate amongst the winners and the losers. And so I think that there continues to be a bipartisan willingness to do a big lift tax package. It takes a lot to get the gross receipts tax down. To lower the gross receipts tax by 1% is $1 billion. And so that means we've got to go find $1 billion from all those exemptions, deductions. I think we should look at some of the personal income tax, the lack of progressivity in our tax code, and put together a balanced package. And I think you're going to see something along those lines. It's been long overdue. I have had an interesting journey with tax reform because I've since I got to the legislature, carried this little bill called combined reporting, which is we're the last Western state that allows these multi-state companies to expense their profits to states that don't have a corporate tax. And it's really unfair to all the other New Mexico businesses that may not be paying corporate tax, but they're paying 4.8%, the pass-through tax. We've been trying to shut that forever. We did close a piece of that in the 2013 omnibus bill. But interestingly, over the years, I was initially told, why would we ever do that? We have all the money we need. Let's wait until we need the money. And then we've needed the money, and it's like, oh, we can't go do that because that's way too scary. We don't know what's going to happen. Interestingly now, Helen Hecht, who holds the job that Frank held, I think at one point at Multi-State Tax Commission, is a really respected expert who has come in and testified many times to the Revenue Stabilization Committee that I serve on. And she said it's the #1 thing New Mexico should do. It doesn't make any sense. It's actually more complicated for these corporations to have to figure out a different set of rules that they've got to play with. And I've actually had that conversation over the last number of years with the Wells Fargo accountant who says, oh, because of New Mexico's unique rules, they can do things differently, but it's a whole different set of rules. So that's one that I think, I hope, will be part of that overall tax package. But those are two huge priorities: education, tax reform, and really, and we'll go back and forth a little bit and then take some questions. We've kind of just been treading water. And so this is a green light moment. And so it's very important to me that we do this right. And I think that's going to mean a lot of communication that hasn't really been there with an executive. And we've got a governor that wants to lead. We've got a House that now has the votes there, and the Senate is going to, the Senate didn't change. We only run every 4 years. So we're 26-16. And so we do have we have conservative Democrats in the Senate, conservative Democrats that we all united when we were when we had a Republican governor, Republican House, It was basically the Democrats in the Senate that united to stop a whole bunch of things that we didn't think were the right things to happen. And so there's going to be discussions on lots of these bills, and not everything is going to pass. But again, I just think that it's an extraordinary opportunity, and I am thrilled after 15 years of doing this to actually move the needle. And this state desperately needs it, and I think we have a huge chance.
So the last thing I'll mention is we're going to be looking at quite a few healthcare-related bills. So there are quite a few protections in Obamacare that, unfortunately, in my view, the current administration in Washington is right now briefing to have repealed. Chief among them is protections for insurance purchasers who have pre-existing conditions. So that is one area where we're going to make a push to include protection for pre-existing conditions in state law, so that if it does go away in Washington, we'll be able to still know that whether you're buying on the marketplace or on the exchange, through your employer, or through the state, that you get coverage for pre-existing conditions. There's a measure that is coming forward. The Health Security Act has come through year after year and is sort of, and I say sort of, passed in various forms, because often it starts as a big proposal for a healthcare overhaul and then kind of becomes a study, and then it passes and then got vetoed, and so it's never actually gone all the way through and gotten signed into law. So we are looking at that, but with some money attached, so that we could explore the possibility of having a Medicaid buy-in for New Mexico. And what this would be is every Medicaid recipient, the Medicaid provider, the insurance company that provides the care, gets paid a premium. They just get paid a premium by a match of federal and state dollars. And so we could look at that and give an option for private citizens who don't otherwise qualify for Medicaid to purchase in to the system at an amount that likely would be less than health care offered on the exchange, and also maybe look at a sliding scale that would have, in effect, be a further Medicaid expansion, but it would. New Mexico is one of, right now, I think, 3 states around the country that's really looking seriously about an actual Medicaid buy-in. We also have a bill that's going to be coming to appoint an executive and legislative commission to look at all of the aspects of healthcare cost in New Mexico. So it's going to go premiums, drug prices, fees charged by pharmacy benefit managers, administrative fees charged to the state by private insurance companies for the administration of both retiree health care but also state employee health care, and identify ways using best available information from around the country of reducing the cost to state government for health care. And the idea would be improve quality, reduce cost, but we need to have a law creating a commission that would have the ability to go into the various state agencies that touch on healthcare and get the information and get the data that they need. That'll go along with the idea of creating a longitudinal data analytics program for the state. This is something that Jenny Ramo and Appleseed have been working on. A few other groups are looking at this. It starts from the idea that in New Mexico there are, we think, and I have to say we think because it's right now not possible to totally know the accurate number, but the best estimate right now is that about 7,500 households in New Mexico use as much as 90% of all public assistance in one form or another, whether that's housing, SNAP, WIC, that's Women, Infant, Children. SNAP is the new term for food stamps. All the other types of assistance to the public. And this is not to say that the 7,500 households have people living in them that are doing something wrong or that they're bad people. What it means is that this number kind of persists year after year in spite of increasing state investments. And so the lesson from that is that what we're doing to try to support families, especially families in crisis, aren't really working. So by looking at the data that can be gathered from all the different departments, and we're looking at New Mexico Tech and Socorro for this program, they would be able to see and help those service providers understand how to do a better job of providing services to families that need it. Combined with a program that Governor-elect Lujan Grisham talked about on the campaign trail of having state ombudsmen that could visit with families on a voluntary basis to assist them in transitioning out of persistent need to be on various forms of public assistance, to get in these houses and really help get families turned around. This is a model that's worked well in other states. And New Mexico, because of the high percentage of our population that receives one form of assistance or another, like, for example, half of the adults in the state of New Mexico are either on Medicaid or are receiving Medicare healthcare coverage. And there's a huge ability for us to make big savings and produce better outcomes if we have the data to guide the policymakers at the different departments make better decisions about how to deliver the services that we're appropriating money for. That also goes along with an idea that is, I think, going to be coming out of the Senate, or at least looked at first in the Senate. I've taken all of the early childhood programs, but not just early childhood education. This would also be money meant to support families, low-income families with kids. There's programs right now at CYFD, Human Services, Public Education Department, and the Department of Health. The idea is to take all those offices and combine them into a new Department of Early Childhood in New Mexico. So we would not be expanding the footprint of government, but we would be aligning all those programs under a single accountable secretary to make sure that if you're a single mom with 3 or 4 kids and 2 jobs, and based on your income level, you need and qualify for public assistance. But if you have to go to 4 different offices across 3 different towns and cities to get the benefits that you need, you're more likely than not to skip going to one or more of those agencies. And so by combining them, the hope is that it would be better for the recipient, but also more efficient on the state side. So that's another idea. I think Senator Padilla is working on that. So that's all I have to get started, and I'll wait for your questions.
Let me just give a couple more things just as a heads up, because I know there's things that folks have worked on in this room. There's going to be a whole range of campaign finance bills, ethics commission. We passed the constitutional amendment, so there needs to be enabling legislation on the ethics commission. And so that's something that we'll spend a lot of time on. The Local Election Act was a massive change in how we do our local elections that Senator Ivy Soto carried, and it passed, but it needs some tweaks and some fixes. He is working on a bill. I heard the other day that it may now be, it's exceeded 400 pages. So all of you that represent entities that deal with your elections are going to need to be aware of that and track that and be part of that. Clearly, climate change, water, energy, these are things where I think finally we have a chance to be proactive here in our state. And we have a governor that wants to lead in this area. So you're going to see methane capture, may be done administratively, some legislation, solar tax credit. I know Bruce was in front of the Committee on Community Solar. We've been trying to do that forever. I'd love to figure out a way to get that built into some type of omnibus energy bill, renewable portfolio standard. There'll be more discussion again about securitization with PNM closing the 2 coal-fired power plants, what that looks like. Again, I think the big difference now is we have a governor that wants to put everyone at the same table. And she said the other day, something I think Bruce King did, he's famous for, put them all in the room in the cabinet and just shut the door, and they're not coming out until the bill's ready to roll, which makes our job a heck of a lot easier because, again, we've been trying to navigate these things. So that's going to be a big one. Criminal justice reform. I think there's the Interim Courts Corrections Committee has been working a bunch this summer putting together an omnibus package that, again, focuses on getting those that are dangerous off the street into the correction department where they belong to be, where they need to be, and getting those that need treatment out of the system. Texas has been doing this, Utah's been doing this, closing prisons in Texas. And yet here we are with a population that's been exploding. We spent a lot of time on all these crime bills over the last number of years. I think there is a bipartisan willingness to do this, and you will see bills along those lines. So that, I think, is kind of it's a highlight of some of the big pieces, but my guess is we'll probably have 3,000 to 4,000 bills this session. So we had about, 1,000? In 2017, and so all of these things that have been, I'm going back and I've got bills that I first introduced in 2011 that worked their way through, finally made it up, were vetoed, and now need to go back through the process. So you're going to see a lot of that. But we welcome questions, and always know that our doors are open. It's a very accessible process over the legislature. I always like to say you can come right down on the floor of either chamber before we start and track us down. And, we'd rather hang out with you than all the lobbyists, so come see us. Thanks.
I thought I would just mention a few things from yesterday that came up so that you had the benefit of, I know 3,000 or 4,000 sounds like an awful lot of bills, so adding 4 or 5 more probably won't tip the scales. But we did have yesterday the immigration panel raise the issue of whether or not there was some state or local control and improvements that could be made to prison systems, particularly in the context of the massive imprisonments that are occurring in relation to immigration issues. The predatory lending, you probably already heard from those people, but they were very concerned that they didn't feel they had a fair chance getting out of committee because the lobbying on the other side was so strong. They were hoping for a per se across the board maximum usurious rate for interest in New Mexico. And they were also very concerned about an exception to the Open Inspection of Public Records Act for the regulatory agency that oversees financial data for the state of New Mexico, and felt that maybe warranted removal. Sustainable electricity, you already mentioned Bruce and his pitch for sustainable electricity. And then the professionalism and ethics. I certainly eagerly wait to see how that will be embodied. The professionalism panel yesterday was addressing a lot of particularly women's issues from the Me Too movement, and feeling that might be an impartial venue for some of these things to be addressed. They did laud you in particular for your work in that context, saying it's good that something was done in that context, with particularly they were talking about lobbyists who are accused of misconduct, and perhaps there weren't easy remedies for elected officials who are accused of this misconduct, but the hope was that this new Constitutional Amendment 2 would be used as an opportunity to create a forum that was fair and impartial, that could adjudicate as apolitically as reasonably possible those kinds of issues. And the Secretary of State clearly indicated that they felt they didn't have the institutional capacity or staffing to be doing all that sort of thing. So there's some hope that you would take legislative action on that and create a body that would do that. So I just wanted to recap for yesterday. So if I misrepresented anything or people have other comments or questions, feel free. At this point, I guess I'll start taking questions.
First, thanks for your presentation, and I hope you're getting a lot of sleep now. It sounds like you're going to not get much after January 15. On the omnibus energy part, we've heard some comments about what, I'm not sure what that means exactly, but I know there's a lot of concern, given the breadth of the bills, that if that means locking everybody into a room until they all agree on all these bills, the danger of getting into this horse trading where you have to basically agree to things on something that you may not feel is reasonable in order to get something else. And I just wondered if you could comment on what exactly you have in mind in terms of omnibus bill, and if you've thought about ways in which you can kind of prevent people, and given, of course, the disparity of the lobbying resources available at the legislature to address these sorts of things.
So let me take that one first and say, you're right, Bruce, that compromise is not easy, and one of the things that I think it's super easy to get in your own silo and just stay there, and the tough part of these jobs is when you're in those situations where you gotta weigh both sides, and omnibus bills generally do mean that there's going to be pieces in there that you like, pieces you don't like, and something in between. We did this actually with Representative Gentry, who was the minority leader in the House, with Governor Martinez. We did this in 2018 with a House bill, a criminal justice omnibus bill that did have a penalty increase that was for a felon in possession of a firearm who commits a violent offense, going from a fourth to a third, which lined it up with the federal statute, which I will tell you, a number of the members in our chamber didn't want, and it probably would never have passed standing alone by itself. Also included in that bill were a whole range of other pieces of legislation, including one that Representative Maestas carried that decriminalized a whole string of things that had no business being criminalized. And so some of members on the other side didn't like that one, but it's one that did go up, and I think, the governor perhaps improperly used a line item veto to take a couple pieces out of it. But there is a feeling that sometimes, rather than try and bang something through or have it die, let's try and see if there's room to find some compromise. Securitization which is the PNM and closing the coal-fired power plants, was, you were there, we were there. It was an all-out battle. I was at the Nature Conservancy's energy panel last week with Governor Ritter, who now is up at CSU doing energy work, and I think that and Doug Howe, and the consensus was securitization is going to be part of the discussion, so it's going to be there, but boy, I think it's going to look different than it did before. So I know it scares people. It scares us too. I mean, we've got to figure out how to do it. But I just think what the governor-elect said, and I really respect this, is she wants the different parties at the table. And I just think we're going to see a different approach than we've seen before on some of these tough issues. And the hope is that some of these, community solar being one that I've carried a couple times and it gets nowhere, I'm hopeful that we can figure out a way to make these things happen.
I'm going to start in the back since those people frequently don't get to speak.
Hey, he already brought this up, and I brought it up to you. But I was just hoping you could tell the crowd what options we have in terms of oversight and limiting immigration prisons in our state, and like what the legislature or the new governor might be capable of doing, especially in light of the fact that our state's getting sued right now in a wrongful death suit for a young woman who died in one of those prisons.
So there are, I think, a few avenues to get. So the question relates to private prison operations in the state. We do have, thanks to Governor Johnson, several facilities where state prisoners are housed in private prisons. They are on fairly long-term contracts, and I think there's going to be a lot of looking at what we can do legislatively to see about bringing private prisons back into being state-run facilities with state employees instead of private contractors. There's a lot of desire for that, I think, in the legislature. The second question, I think, relates to there's a number of counties in the state that were unable or unwilling to continue to operate county jails, contracted with neighboring counties to house inmates. There's that situation, I think, in Torrance County. Representative McQueen might know. I think Torrance County doesn't have a jail anymore, and so their inmates have to go to a neighboring county. So now, there were a few counties. One was Cibola County, where they now have a jail that's empty, and they've decided to get into a contract with a private prison operator who then uses those facilities to house federal immigration detainees. We undoubtedly need more oversight on what's happening inside of those facilities. It's without a doubt. We had a presentation on this in front of the Interim Courts, Corrections, and Justice Committee. There were a great many people shocked to hear some of the stories that were told about what's happening in these county-owned buildings and that are being leased and operated by private prison contractors for immigration, for ICE, or for other parts of Homeland Security. There were two ideas suggested at the meeting. One would be to prohibit the state or county from leasing a facility to a private prison operator that would then partner with the federal government for immigration detainees to be kept in those facilities. So just a prohibition, county cannot do this. Option B is give the Attorney General or the Department of Public Safety, or both, increased supervisory authority to go in and inspect what's happening inside those county-owned buildings that are leased out to private prison operators. So keep them publicly owned buildings, but greatly increase the authority of the state to go in and inspect and ensure that conditions meet established minimum standards of care. My view at this point is that the option A of prohibiting counties from leasing their facilities is potentially problematic out of fear that the county, upon being told that they could not lease it to a private prison operator, would instead sell it to that private prison operator, take the building out of public ownership, and then you would have the company owning the building but still working with ICE and others in the Homeland Security Department with very little, if any, state oversight. So that's the policy choice that's been presented, and I think whatever outcome gets us to increased scrutiny and oversight is the way we ought to go. And I'm a little nervous about the prohibition simply because I don't want to see all these county-owned buildings being sold to the Geo Group and Core Civic with very little state oversight, because they'd then be leased to the federal government. So that's my take on it right now.
I didn't hear any discussion from either of you about the idea with the budget surplus ensuring that the public employees' retirement is made securely solvent. Is there any discussion that's being had at the legislature with respect to that?
So I shouldn't say we, I met with the executive director and a few board members of Public Employees Retirement Association last week or the week before, and I asked the question, well, we've got this surplus, why don't we put some money into the corpus of para? $100 million buys 1% improvement in solvency in 30 years, which is a huge amount of money for a very minor effect in 30 years, right? Because that's $100 million otherwise that we could use for roads or bridges or broadband expansion or any number of other important public works projects that could have an immediate economic and jobs benefit. So the idea of using the money for that, it doesn't work given the amount of money that we have and the effect we're trying to achieve. You know, we're right around 70%, I think, solvent right now. We have 70% solvency, which is better than some. 25 years out, it looks even better, but there's a few things that we can do in the short term. One thing that that makes New Mexico almost unique in the entire country for our public employee benefits is that we are, if not the only one of a very few states that has a guaranteed cost of living adjustment regardless of the contributions and regardless of investment earnings. So almost every other state that has a defined benefits program for public employees will say you'll get a COLA, cost of living adjustment, but you'll get it based on the amount of money that we have available to give in a COLA. Some of them are based on CPI, so some of them will say you get a COLA that's based on the consumer price index for the region, and that's set in law. Other states will say they'll calculate how much they can afford, and that becomes the COLA for that year. The other thing that New Mexico is almost unique in is that the COLA is there even if the public employees paying into the pension benefit don't get a raise. So the problem over the last 8 years is that state employee contributions have stayed mostly flat, while the retirees whose benefits are being paid by current employees, they've gone up 3% every year no matter what. And so that has put a huge strain. Right now, the para is having to sell hundreds of millions of dollars of assets every month in order to make their distributions. And so they're eating away at the corpus in order to pay the benefit because of the COLA. So there's some conversation about there's two things that if done would get us to complete solvency in as little as 5 to 10 years. That would be matching the COLA to what we can afford. So we're paying the COLA on a checkbook, not on a credit card. Or going to a CPI adjusted COLA for para employees. The other would be getting about a 3% increase in contributions, and that could be split at whatever ratio is acceptable to para in the legislature between the state and the employee. So about a 3% bump on contributions and a change in the COLA calculation would make New Mexico at the top of the list nationally to have a fully funded public retirement. So those are some ideas, and there will be legislation on that. But our interim pension reform committee has yet to make a recommendation on the final proposed solution.
Let me just add one thing, because I see lots of retired state employees. I think Brian and I probably have more in our district than anywhere else in the state. And elections mean something. And when you run for governor and you take a position, which the governor-elect did, in saying she didn't want to go and get into the COLAs, I think that is a framework that we probably are going to be within. I agree completely with what Brian's saying in terms of the big moves that would be required to get there. But I think she kind of took that one off the table. In some of the preliminary budget numbers that we've seen coming out of the Legislative Finance Committee, there are some increases in the state share, and I think that's something that we certainly can do. Also, the other key point is that we've so grossly underfunded government with all these vacancies, and I think the point was made, as we bring more employees in, you've got active people paying into the system. So it's a huge issue that's out there. I'd be surprised if this is one where we end up with some massive reform given everything else on our plate.
I think there were some questions in the front that I missed earlier. Was it you, Lynn? What Allegra asked, okay. Are there any? Okay, Rick.
Thank you both for your service, but as a employee of local government who deals with IPRA requests every week, I'm sure you've heard from public bodies about the growing burden. We're all for transparency, but is there any possibility of any relief for local bodies? I think you need to hear from them how much is actually being spent in staff time and resources on responding to IPRAs, and the numbers are growing. I guess I heard at the FOG conference, which I didn't get to go to, there were some numbers thrown around from maybe the city of Albuquerque or Bernalillo County about the amount of resources they're putting into IPRA and the increase year to year.
So, and it's not just county, it's also the state. it's unbelievable what some of these state agencies have, the number of employees that are doing nothing but IPRA requests. I think the openness is a good thing. It's very, to the extent that we're going to try and ramp it back. Some of you may have seen the Albuquerque Journal editorial this morning where I was literally posing some questions about the Ethics Commission and when complaints become public. So if you have a frivolous complaint, does it immediately get put out there? And you know, certainly the Albuquerque Journal didn't like that approach. So again, the transparency is important, but we've got to make this work. And I think from the state perspective, we need to give the agencies the resources to be able to comply. And I would assume the same thing applies at your level. You need to make sure you've got the ability to do this. And so, again, I can't stress enough how different things look on the financial front for funding of what I consider to be an essential government purpose, which is complying with this law that we've put in place. And so at the state level, you'll see that funding come through. And again, I think obviously the local government issue is going to be similar, but local governments are also going to benefit here, I think, as the state sees this windfall and as money comes out. We didn't talk at all about capital outlay, which are dollars and bricks and mortar money that go into districts. I think we're going to have large amount of that kind of money for roads, infrastructure, all those one-time pieces as well. So again, to the extent that we're going to get into the statute and tweak things, I'd be surprised. I've seen those bills, and they generally don't fare very well. But the point you make is spot on in terms of what it takes to comply. And again, I think I would answer your question from a resource standpoint.
Any more questions? If there are not, I saw Bill Sleece here, and he's willing to do what is on your agenda as the Bill Sleece Hour, which is the hour you've all been looking forward to, your one ethics credit. And he's willing to do that immediately if you all stay in the room, and then we could leave 15 minutes earlier. So it is Friday. If you're interested in doing that, vote with your bodies. If you're not interested in doing that, and I see everybody leave the room and go out in the hall, we'll wait until we can get people back in and we'll resume the program.
You're wrong. We saw nothing but depression from the two of you. God, good to see a smile.
It's been that way.
Thanks so much. How exciting. It is pretty cool. It's crazy.
Good. Oh, I love it. Thank you. Sure. Peter, thanks, man. Do you like the screen of Peter just set up for your place? No. Oh, it's verbal. I see. Yeah, right on. Right? Yeah, man. Right.
You can use that if you want to stand. Otherwise, the desk mics. Are you going to do PowerPoint or
not? We just stand. I'm going to drink some water, and you think they're ready?
Those are good. Yeah, I think so. I didn't see very many people leave.
No? So this means you guys want to start, or did half of you leave? Yeah? Okay, rock and roll. All right. You guys can hear me in the back? Yeah? No, you don't care? You can wave? Okay. My name is Bill Sleece. I'm Chief Disciplinary Counsel for the New Mexico Disciplinary Board, and we'll try to get you out of here by 4:30. I thought what we would talk about this year is mostly whatever you want to talk about, but I do have some items to touch on that pertain to what's going on both in the state in terms of regulatory initiatives and what's going on nationally. And this works much better if you ask me questions as you go. Rather than make you run around the room, I'll try to hear, although talk to this ear because this one's not as good. And I'll try to repeat the questions so that we can answer it. I really do encourage you to ask questions. We've tried in the last 8 years that I've been in this job to reform. There's always going to be a discipline component to regulation. I mean, that's just the nature of the beast. But we've tried to reform the office so that it's more of a regulatory office, that it's a resource, and we'll talk some about that in just a minute. But that's kind of where I want to start, is what you all understand or know about the disciplinary process, or at least what you think the disciplinary process consists of. In other words, how do things get from day 1 to day 35 or whatever, 350? Do you know how the discipline process works? How complaints get through the system? I'm telling you, it works much better if somebody talks. Otherwise, we're going to be here 59 minutes while I wait for somebody to answer even a simple question. Anybody know how it works? Who do we get complaints from? Clients, absolutely. That's probably the major source of complaints that we get are from clients. Are we restricted, do you think, only to client complaints? Lawyers can complain, judges can complain, judges not as much as you would think. I think judges hesitate sometimes out of a concern, and understandably so, that their bias could be questioned at that point. And I'm not saying it will, but I think that's the concern. A lot of times what you'll see judges do is wait until the matter's concluded completely, and then if they have a complaint, they'll file it. Any idea? So clients for sure, other lawyers, judges. How about opposing party? Not opposing counsel, opposing party. Absolutely, we get complaints of that nature too. Any ideas of how many lawyers are licensed in New Mexico? Actively licensed. Practicing. How many? 3,000 somebody said? That's low. 8,000 is pretty close. 6 is close. 7,700, according to the last State Bar demographics. Of those 7,700, do you have any idea how many complaints we get every year? Too low. 400, he said, too low. 1,000, a little too high. It's about 700, right? So about 10%. Some lawyers get more than one complaint, so that's a rough 10%. But to about 10%, and that's true nationally. If you go to Colorado, where they have about 37,000, 38,000 lawyers, they get about 4,000 complaints a year, so it's about 10%. And so those complaints come in, the first place they come of those 700 complaints are to me. So I intake all the complaints that come in the office. And I had a question, I was talking to some lawyers actually just yesterday about this, and one of them raised their hand and they were very frustrated because they had to respond to a complaint that they said they knew there was no merit to it. Now, I'm not going to ask you guys to raise your hands and tell me if you have the same reaction, because I don't want to know if you've had complaints against you or not. What I will tell you is kind of the standard we use. So how many of you are litigators? Some of you are litigators. Great. All right. What kind of litigation do you do, sir?
Civil rights.
Civil rights.
Class actions.
Civil rights, class action, that kind of stuff. All right. And so occasionally, so plaintiffs work primarily? Yes. So when you file a civil rights claim, every now and then you see a motion to dismiss, yeah? Occasionally, right? And the motion to dismiss standard that the judge follows, what is that, roughly?
Well, it's often on qualified immunity. Is what a lot of
Set aside the qualified immunity stuff. How about a motion to dismiss standard for the judge? Right. Judge looks at the face of the complaint, right? Face of the complaint is if everything in, well, not everything, if what's stated here is true, is it sufficient to state a violation? I get the evidence has to prove it and all of that stuff, right? What I try to remind lawyers is that our office follows the same standard as a motion to dismiss standard in the disciplinary process. And what I mean by that is when a complaint comes in from any of those sources that you identified, clients, other parties, other lawyers, judges, they don't have to articulate anything in particular in terms of sort of form over substance. They don't have to tell me, I think my lawyer violated 16101, right? Because most clients aren't going to be at that granular level. They don't even have to use our form. We have a form, but they're not required to use it. They just have to articulate something about what they think the lawyer has done that's improper. And then it's incumbent on me to look at that and determine if that was true. I'm not saying I believe it's true, but if that were true, is it sufficient to state a violation of the rules of professional conduct, as I understand them applied in New Mexico? And if the answer is yes, it's going to go out to the lawyer for a response, right? And then the lawyer is going to respond, and then there's going to be an investigation, and then some are going to get dismissed, and some aren't. Any idea of what that breakdown is? Some are dismissed, some aren't. So of those 700 complaints, what do you think? 60-40? Nah, it's 75%? Even that's actually a little bit low, right? It's closer in the range of, and this is also true nationally, about somewhere close to 90% end up dismissed at some point in the process, right? So about 10% result in discipline. And some people say, well, that's because you guys don't know what the hell you're doing, right? And I hear that, I get it, and you're welcome to that opinion. I would suggest to you it's different, and I take comfort in the fact that likewise, nationally, about 10%, actually in some jurisdictions, it's like 3 or 4% of their complaints actually result in discipline. We're more in line with what happens nationally on average, somewhere in the 10% neighborhood. What that tells you is about 90% of complaints get dismissed. And I would suggest to you that 90% of those complaints get dismissed, a good percentage of them, because they are what I call customer service complaints. Do you know what I mean by that? Yeah.
Yeah, just not staying in touch enough with the client.
Right, so sometimes it's a communication failure. Now, 16104 says if you don't communicate with your clients, you're going to get at least potentially into trouble discipline-wise. So how is it I can dismiss it if you're not communicating with your clients? What do you think? Probably because your communication's adequate. It's just the client doesn't know that, right? It's that the client, on some of those first meetings, they evaluate how a legal matter is going to proceed, by and large, unless you have a more sophisticated client. They evaluate how a legal matter is going to proceed primarily from what they learn from the media. Right, so they think you should wrap this up in about an hour, unless maybe this is a mini series. They'll give you about 6 weeks, right? And then they want to know what's going on. Now that's a little hyperbolic, but honestly, most clients, especially individuals who are not sophisticated in the legal system, they're not experienced in the legal system, no reason they should be, they're going to expect you to wrap that up within a couple of months, and it's going to start feeling really long to them when it goes beyond that. They're also going to think, again informed by popular media, that you're working 24/7 on their case, because you're only handling 1 or 2 cases at a time, right? That's your caseload, most of you, isn't it? You just have 1 or 2 cases. Why are you laughing, sir? You have a few more than that? Yeah, but clients don't understand that. And what I try to tell lawyers in some of the education we do is manage those client expectations, and I don't mean that condescendingly to the client. I mean, talk to the client about what their legal representation is going to look like, right? So whether it's transactional, some of you do transactional work, real estate type work, that has a life of its own, right? There's certain things that have to happen. You're pulling title reports, you're looking at surveys, you're looking at all that kind of stuff, right? And if it's litigation like a civil rights case, I don't know if this is still true. When I was practicing, I did some civil rights work. The federal court here, it was about 18 months to 2 years to get from complaint filed to trial, if that's what it was going to be. So talking to the clients about what that's going to look like. There's times when it's busy, there's times when it's slack. That's what it's going to look like. So complaint comes in, I look at all of them, goes out, as I told you, to the lawyers. They respond, dismissed, or it goes off to charges, right? Goes off to charges, can be anywhere from an admonition all the way up to disbarment, which in New Mexico is permanent. And that's the sanction phase, right? Now, what does that, let me tell you that the reported opinions will routinely say that the purpose of the discipline system is not to punish lawyers. I would suggest to you that if you talk to lawyers who've been disciplined, they're going to tell you that they feel that there's a certain punitive aspect to it, right? Set that aside for a minute. How does that system sound to you in terms of how you regulate attorney conduct? Like a great plan? Right? Let me ask it another way. Have you ever heard of a firefighter's model? What happens when do you know how firefighters earn their living? No? Nobody knows? Alarm goes off in the station, right? Firefighters jump on the truck. They zoom out to the fire. They pour water on the fire, at least here, right? If you're back east, they run into buildings. That's insane. Right? But here they go and pour water on the fire, they stand back, they look at the damage, the homeowner comes up, it's a disaster for everybody, yeah? That's a firefighter's model, right? Think about the regulatory system in most jurisdictions, and it's a firefighter's model, I would suggest to you. Alarm goes off, which is that complaint comes in the door. We run out, we investigate. If there's really a fire, and I told you there's about 90% of the time maybe there's a fire or maybe there's not a big fire or maybe there's no fire. But the other 10% there's a fire, we put out the fire, and then everybody stands back. And I would tell you, it's probably a disaster for most people involved in that system, isn't it? It's not a good day for the court. Justice Daniels was here at lunchtime. One of the things I've heard Justice Daniels say from the bench often is one of their hardest days on the bench is when they have to discipline a lawyer. So I can tell you that the court takes no pleasure in seeing a lawyer disciplined. And I don't speak for the court. I'm telling you what I hear from the justice. I can tell you that our office takes no pleasure in seeing a lawyer disciplined, right? Despite what some people think in terms of our office's view of the world, that's a bad day for everybody, right? It's definitely a bad day for the lawyer. And who do you think it's the worst day of all for, especially for a busy lawyer? For their clients, right? Talk about the building burned down with tons of damage, because most lawyers who are unable to practice, which is the more serious end of discipline, suspension, disbarment, today, imagine I represented all of you, right? Today I'm your lawyer. Tomorrow I'm not your lawyer because I just got suspended or disbarred. Now what? You're going to be comfortable like, nah, no big deal. Somebody else will come along, except I've got a hearing tomorrow, right? And my deposition's next week, and we were supposed to close on the house the following month, right? All of a sudden that becomes a really pressing problem for those people who the lawyer is no longer able to represent. Now, am I saying that that model is bad? I'm not saying that model is bad. You're always going to have a need for that model with certain type of conduct. Absolutely. Right? There's going to be consequence from certain type of conduct. You steal your client's money, that's going to be firefighters, right? Somebody's going to come out, put out the fire, try to recover whatever you can in the wreckage. The lawyer's going to have consequences as a result. In New Mexico, presumptive sanction for stealing your client money is what? Disbarment, absolutely. There's 35 cases that say that, right? But that's only one aspect of a real regulatory system. And so that's one of the first things, and that was a long way to get to one of the first things that's happening in regulation. And I'd like to think that New Mexico is one of the leaders in this concept. It's a concept that actually started primarily in Australia, of all places. There's some aspects of it in the UK, definite aspects of it in Nova Scotia, one of the Canadian provinces. Illinois is working on it, Colorado's working on it, we're working on it. And it's called proactive attorney regulation. Anybody heard of that? No? There's actually a committee, the Proactive Attorney Regulation Committee, right? And the concept is that in addition to a firefighter's model for some conduct, there's also a fire marshal's model, right? And so if you know how the fire marshal works, before the fire starts, the fire marshal comes out and inspects the residence or inspects the commercial building, and he says, the wiring here is not very good, and you've got old lights here, and you have a space heater here that's not compliant, and it's going to catch the drapes on fire there, right? And then you try to remediate that situation so that the conduct changes and the building never burns down. Well, I think you can apply the same concept to regulation, right? So if you look at lawyer conduct by and large, a lot of the customer service complaints and a lot of the lower level misconduct, the violations of the rules that are not of a more serious nature, the stuff that warrants a censure or a suspension or a disbarment, can be addressed, I think, in an alternative way, and that's what we're studying, which is what's called a proactive model, the fire marshal's model, right? And so that's a few things. You do things like, how many of you have had to take or are planning on taking the mandatory trust accounting class, right? And you were thrilled by it, weren't you? You know, candor to discipline counsel is required, right? What do you think? 17204 was amended 2 years ago now to make you take this trust accounting class. That's part of a proactive attorney regulation initiative, right? Most lawyers who are having trouble with their trust accounts are not stealing their clients' money. In fact, it's a small fraction. There are some, a couple or more every year probably, but most lawyers are not. Most lawyers are having trouble with their trust account because they've not been taught how to manage it. They're too busy to manage it properly, which I'm not sure is an excuse, but that's what we hear. They're not familiar with how to do it, right? It's gotten away from them. They don't use a professional. they don't know how to do it themselves, whatever the issue is. That's probably a lawyer who's not stealing money, who's not commingling, who's not doing anything wrong other than really bad at record keeping. They've got a mess. It's a big tangled mess that needs some unknotting. And primarily what they need is education. And so part of the concept between the 17204 mandatory class is not just to require you guys go do something to listen to our office once every 3 years. It's really designed to try to get lawyers to focus on how to manage a trust account and give them an education to compliance tool so they can do that. I will tell you that some jurisdictions have gone a step further. I don't think it's the right wording because it immediately sets off this visceral reaction. But they have random trust audit programs. Anybody heard of those? Now, when you hear audit, what's the first thing you think of? You think the IRS, right? And that doesn't feel comfortable at all, which is why I think that the language may be wrong. But I'll tell you what those programs actually are their compliance tools to try to educate lawyers rather than discipline lawyers. And that's a concept I'm still interested in. I don't know if we'll ever get to the point that I can convince the court to enact that sort of rule. But what it would look like is this. And I'm curious in the reaction I get from you guys. Some of you have trust accounts? By the way, I'm not taking names. I'm not going to come and audit your account now because I don't have the authority to, unless you have a complaint about your trust accounting. So the way that program looks, the model I'll give you is New Jersey. And New Jersey, what happens in North Carolina, which are the two leaders, what happens is they've got an algorithm on a computer. The algorithm on the computer spits out a identification of whose trust account gets audited in whatever period of time. And do you think they just show up at the lawyer's office? We want to see your trust records. No, right? That's not education of compliance. That's that sort of intimidation factor that's not the way you should regulate people, right? What they do is they call the lawyer and they say, hey, Peter, your name popped up, and I'm wondering if maybe January 15th we can come by. Here's what we're going to want to see. And then Peter says, the 15th's not going to work. I've got something going that day. Can we do it the 17th? Yeah, I've got time on the 17th. We'll come out on the 17th. And we'll come to you, not you come to us. Because it's easier if you need to find stuff. And then Peter says, what do you want to see? And I tell him I want to see reconciliations. I want to see client ledgers and general ledgers and bank statements and evidence of deposits and withdrawals. And he says, yeah, you know what? I don't actually have the reconciliations quite up to speed. I know I'm supposed to do it monthly, but they're not all right there. I've been reconciling just not as faithfully. Now, do I say, oh, I'm sorry, we're not auditing you, we're sending you a complaint now? No, in the New Jersey program, what they say is, that's fine, gather what you've got, let's look at what you're doing, let's see why you don't have the reconciliations. We get there, and then what happens in those programs is they go through it. If they find there's conversion of client funds, if they're stealing, of course that's going to turn into a disciplinary matter. But if it's just some procedural defects, what's going to happen is they're going to say, here's a list of corrective suggestions, right? Do this better, do this differently. Maybe you could benefit from talking with the CPA. Maybe you need a better software program. We'll be back in 3 months, see how it's going, or 6 months, whatever time period they set. And then when they come back, most lawyers, according to my colleagues in North Carolina and New Jersey, have taken the corrective action, and that's the end of it. It's not a complaint. It doesn't ever turn into a complaint. He's not lost control of his trust account. In fact, now he's running it probably better than ever. And one of those customer service complaints, or more importantly, one of those complaints later that turns into a problem because now there's conversion, or it appears there's conversion because we can't untangle the records, those start falling off. So that's an aspect of proactivity, right? All we've got now is the education piece, maybe someday the other. I have had people suggest that we offer it voluntarily. I'll tell you that I'm happy to offer it voluntarily. I get there's resistance. I'm from the government, I'm here to help. Nobody wants to do it. What is he really looking for? Really to get lawyers to compliance, unless they're doing something like stealing their client funds, right? So I think that's one aspect of proactive regulation. The other thing is, anybody see the proposed rule changes that were pending before the court this past couple of months? I think the period is closed. One of those was a formal diversion program rule, right? And so formal diversion program, anybody do any kind of work in the criminal arena at all? Nobody? All right, well, in criminal defense work, there's a concept of pre-prosecution diversion. You've heard of that, right? Where somebody's conduct is fairly low violation. They just need some remediation. You take them off the regular criminal track, and you remediate, right? Well, the same concept I think can be applied to low-level violations of the rules of professional conduct, the stuff that would get you an admonition, maybe in some circumstances a reprimand. The lawyer just needs some retooling in some probably discrete area. And so you take the lawyer, you build a diversion program with the lawyer's consent, still has to be approved through the board, and then you remediate, right? And if it works, then the lawyer comes out the other side, again, no discipline, right? And so rather than being admonished, the lawyer actually has tools to go forward. And part of the idea behind a proactive attorney regulation model is that you get away from the concept of punishment, you get away from the concept of we're here only to protect the public, because really what we should be doing is promoting the public's interest. And promoting the public's interest means protecting them, sure, from substandard and sharp practices and all of that stuff. But it also means if you've got a lawyer who's going to provide really beneficial service but just needs a little bit of retooling, that you do that. I think that's an obligation of a proper regulatory system. We also offer, if anybody's a solo practice in the room and they want this, again, I will not interpret anything to it if you ask me for this. But we have about a 20-page self-audit form that you can go through and just sort of self-assess your practice. You don't have to turn it back into me. I won't even, I say this with all due respect to all of you, 2 days after you send me the email asking me for it and I send it to you, I will have forgotten that I even did that. So I'm not going to track, somebody asked, Peter asked for a self-audit, I wonder what's wrong, right? Not at all, right? But if you want it, email me. I'll send you the self-audit form. It's got about 20 pages of, you can go through. It's an inventory. Are you using retention letters? Are you using non-retention letters when you don't take somebody in? Are you billing? Are you doing your monthly reconciliation on trust? All the kind of things that a practitioner should be thinking about. And probably if you're in a big firm, they might be doing for you. One of the things we've done with that is anybody going from a large firm, public defender, DA's office, we're also trying to flag them. And again, not flag them in the sense of let's keep an eye on them, flag them in the sense of through the state bar, they tell me and themselves, lawyers going from safety net to solo practice, maybe small firm, let's make sure lawyer has resources to succeed, right? And so what the lawyer will get from my office and the state bar executive director or general counsel is a joint letter that says, congratulations, we wish you every success. Here's a list of things to think about to maybe help you, right? Here's a list of possible software programs you can look at to help you with time and management and billing and trust accounting. Here's the trust accounting class and when it's going to be offered. Here's information on succession planning so that if you go out unexpectedly, your clients have an ability to know what's going to happen with their files. Here's a list of brokers so you can go get some malpractice insurance. If you start struggling with the practice in a sense that it's testing your mental health or your physical health, here's JLAB, right? And so it's a resource letter for the lawyer. And the concept, again, being that you help the lawyer as opposed to wait. And what other people call that fireman's model is also the whack-a-mole, which is when the lawyer finally pops their head up having done something wrong, you whack them, right? Well, that's not the effective way to regulate. So, proactive attorney regulation. That's one of the things that we're doing. Do you guys have questions? You really can ask questions as we go. You're just tired? Have you been here 2 days? 2 days and you had to wait for me to talk to you about ethics? Oh, boy. And no videos, sorry. All right, let's talk about the second thing, advertising. You don't have to self-identify. Lawyers advertise, right? And lawyers advertising has become pretty entrenched ever since Bates versus Arizona, goes back to the 70s. Lawyers didn't used to be able to advertise. Commercial speech pretty robust now, and even more robust in probably the last 10 years. Lawyer advertising is pretty active. We do get advertising complaints. Now, how many of you know about the advertising rules generally, right? Generally, yeah. So they're in the 700 series of the 16-, right? And what I would tell you is the advertising rules have some generalized concepts, right? The 701 talks about not lying in ads. Not lying affirmatively, not lying by omission. And then 703 is no solicitation. Any of you ever saw the movie The Rainmaker, where Danny DeVito's in the guy's hospital room and he's leaning on the Guy with the cast on his leg and he's trying to make him sign up for a personal injury representation, that's 703, right? And then there's a couple other rules that talk about how letterheads are and can you call yourself Bill and Associates if you're only Bill and that kind of stuff. About 3 years ago now, a national group called the Association of Professional Responsibility Lawyers. Those are guys who represent other lawyers in discipline matters, in malpractice suits, that kind of stuff. They did a survey, 51 jurisdictions, so all of the US and one of our territories. And their survey was basically to regulators to ask the question of what advertising violations do you see? What advertising violations are you actually enforcing? And who are you getting your complaints about advertising from? Let me start with the last one. Who do you think we get? I would say all of our complaints about advertising that I can remember in the last 8 years. Who do you think they come from? Other lawyers. Why? Because they're so robustly reporting all perceived violations of the rules of professional conduct? They're jealous. It's competition, right? And the complaints are of an interesting variety, but that's exactly right. And what the survey found is that was true nationally, right? The complaints that were being made about lawyers related to advertising were coming from other lawyers. And in most jurisdictions, I'm going to set Florida aside. Is anybody originally from Florida here or spend any time there? So I can pick on them? Yeah? Their discipline counsel is a good friend of mine, and I say this, I would say it to his face. They, until recently, have had a very different view of how they should handle advertising enforcement, right? They were a little more what I would call aggressive. They primarily did it under the misrepresentation rule, so that wasn't necessarily different, but they would take cases that included, at least I heard, and I don't know if this is urban legend, that they took one case for which they got sued in U.S. District Court as a First Amendment violation, but they were trying to enforce prohibition against misleading because the lawyer had too much smoke in his advertisements. And I don't know exactly how that was misleading, but there was something troubling about all the smoke in his advertisement, right? So, and by the way, they lost that in the federal district court, is what I was told. I do know, this is not urban legend, that they've lost every single case they've taken in the last several years against advertising lawyers because their enforcement has been much more than just misrepresentation. But what the April study found is exactly that. Misrepresentation and direct in-person solicitation are the two rules that are being complained about and that are being enforced. Everything else, if you look at the 700 series, Bill and Associates, Bill's a specialist, Bill's an expert, those are not being complained about. They're not being enforced because they're pretty vague. There's pretty robust First Amendment protection. There's a whole bunch of issues associated with that. And so what April did is they proposed to the ABA, who promulgates model rules, and then the states adopt rules if they like them. Our rules of professional conduct are primarily based on the model rules. ABA has amended its model rules for advertising basically to say no lying and no personal solicitation. If you actually look at the personal solicitation rule, it touches on another topic I'm going to talk to you about in just a minute. But it touches on social media, right? Because if you were in an auto accident 20 years or so ago, as I was, what will happen 20 years ago is so the older me would receive mail stamped lawyer advertising. And then you'd open up the letter and it would say, "Dear Mr. Sleece, I see you were recently involved in an auto accident and perhaps you had an injury and perhaps we could help you recover for your damages." Now, first off, that was allowed under our advertising rules. How did they know to even send me a letter? They're out there scouting the street, like chasing the ambulance literally. Police report, of course. Somebody went down to the police station, pulled the police report, got my address, sent me a letter. Right? 20 years ago, what did not exist? The internet was not certainly robust. Even more than the internet, what didn't exist? Let's make it maybe 30 years ago. 25 years ago, I remember holding a brick to my head to talk. Cell phones, right? Any of you have landlines still? Some of you, that's good. Most of you not, right? Most of you not because your landline is this, right? And so, so I told you 20 plus years ago I was in an accident. 3 weeks ago I was in an accident, right? And so police come, and we're all on the side of the road, and they ask for contact information, and I give them the cell phone number, right? Now, I haven't gotten anything yet because I haven't seen this in New Mexico, but I'll tell you, especially in the larger metropolitan areas and mostly back Midwest to the east, that cell number goes on the police report. Lawyer does what lawyer used to do 20 years ago, send somebody down to the police station, pulls a police report, but now instead of wasting their time mailing you stuff, because there's a lot of cost associated with that, they just text you. I understand you were recently in an accident. Perhaps you could use my services. Now, if you read our rules, 16703, it says no in-person or real-time electronic solicitation unless you had a prior relationship. And that's right out of the model rule that's now been amended. But before, that's what it said, right? Does that violate that rule?
Sure. Yeah.
It does?
Well, isn't it real time? I don't know. Text real time.
Gotta change the rule.
Is text real time? Well, let me ask you this question. Any of you made the mistake, as I did, of agreeing that a retailer could send you notices and coupons not by email, but by text? Don't make that mistake. Let me start with that. I get about 3 texts a day from one retailer in particular. I've tried to unsubscribe a dozen times. I've given up. So when I get that text, in fact, I probably have one right now, what do you think I do with it? I sit there and read it carefully and I say, Joe's Coffee, that's not what it is, right? Joe's Coffee is giving me 40% off. That actually is one of the texts I got. It's not Joe's Coffee. 40% off all red wine when I buy 4 or more. Well, damn it, I guess I got to go buy 4 or more wines at Joe's because they sent me a text and I have to do it. Yeah? Now, I'm just behind because this came when I was walking into the room. What do you think I normally do with those texts? In fact, what I'm going to do right now. I swipe it and it's gone, right? And so the ethics opinions that have come out nationally now have said that that sort of communication does not violate the rule. Because just like a letter, just like an email, you can dump it, and there's no ability for the individual to put any kind of pressure on you, right? Think about it. If they're in person or they're on the phone, they can actually put some pressure on you, especially in person, especially if you're laying in a bed in a cast, right? But when it's electronic like this, or an email, you swipe it and you get rid of it. I don't know if we'll adopt those changes to the advertising rules. That's going to go to our Code of Professional Conduct Committee. They'll make that decision and decide how to proceed. But possibly, right? And it would reflect really what goes on in terms of enforcement and the kind of complaints we get. Yes, ma'am. Right. She would think, oh my God, they know about me personally. Maybe my daughter called them and set this up, right? Yeah. What's interesting to me about social media, and we'll talk about it, in fact, we can talk about it now and then I'll come back to this other thing. What's interesting to me about social media is, as you would expect, the technology is moving much faster than the practice, and the regulation of the practice is we're trying to play some catch up. And so each jurisdiction is going to take a little bit different approach to how they do that. I'll tell you the other way that lawyers were advertising that has been found to be acceptable and not a violation is by tweeting. Tweeting is now, what, 280 characters? And in some jurisdictions, including New Mexico, you're supposed to put the name and address of the lawyer and say lawyer advertising. By the time you do that, if your name is really long, right, you're going to eat up most of your characters. Come see. Oh, I'm out of characters, right? So, so that's some jurisdictions restrict it that way, but they've got to be careful because content restriction can pretty quickly run afoul of First Amendment. And so I think you'll see maybe a more cohesive development over the course of the next 5 or so years as both the rule changes and as we catch up with technology. Let me ask you about social media since we're talking about social media, because texting is a form of social media. Any of you starting to see in your discovery social media requests asking your client their social media usage? Yes, sir? Like what are you seeing? Interrogatories? So in car accident cases, they're asking your client all social media they use. And of course, what do you think they're looking for? They're just curious? Let's go see what they're posting, right? Right. Something that might be used as a party admission against them, right? Something that might bear on their credibility, right? The leading social media case, which I don't know if I've ever talked to you guys about, it's actually a spoliation case where a lawyer instructed a client to destroy a Facebook page under the misguided notion that if that wasn't in existence when they signed the interrogatory answer, then it was truthful that the client had no social media presence, except the defendant had already seen it and they'd actually sent a copy of a picture and it went to a loss of consortium claim. The client had a t-shirt on that said, "I love hot moms," and the defendant's thought was, well, you know, we can at least ask the judge to show that to the jury on the loss of consortium claim. Well, the lawyer thought the same thing and asked the client to destroy it, right? So they're looking for that kind of stuff, right? What I'd suggest to you is if you look at the recent amendment to our Code of Professional Conduct Committee, and in particular the commentary to 16101, it specifically says now that lawyers have at least some, they'll get upset if I say duty because it's not in the black letter. Lawyers should be cognizant of, as part of their competence duties, the need to talk to their clients about social media use and the risks and benefits of social media use and privacy settings, right? And what that means, if you cut through all of that language, is I think you've got an obligation to start talking to your clients about how they're using social media and to warn them not to get rid of content, right? Now, you can raise privacy settings for sure, because you don't have to continue to let the world see what idiocy is going on your social media presence if it's going to be a problem, right? And you can also talk to them about not posting anything else. Stop posting, right? But you can't tell them to get rid of content unless you're preserving it in some fashion that the other side can see. And if you remember 16304, that requires you to preserve all evidence in an ongoing matter, but it also requires you to preserve anything of potential evidentiary value, and that means you've got to anticipate matters. So there might not actually be anything present. So when a client first comes in, you've got to talk to them about what their social media use is, what their privacy settings look like, and reduce to writing the fact that you told them, don't destroy any content. Yeah?
I have a question about that, which is that technology has evolved to the point now that there's like continuous video of everything.
Right.
And in terms of the spoliation of evidence and the preservation of evidence, it seems unreasonable, borderline impossible,
right,
to really keep the data that is all that video.
Right. I mean, there's not anything you're going to be able to do with clients who are constantly uploading and downloading and destroying and getting rid of. But from the day they come in, the first conversation you've got to have with them is stop and keep whatever's there right now and as far back as you've got. And if that means we have to do a mirror image of your drive, if we have to ask for you to download it all on hard copy, some way that if the other side comes knocking and asking for it, which they should, it should be part of the standard stuff that you get asked about, we can produce it, right?
Would that be incident-based, for example, with my company is a bus company, and we take video of all the buses driving all the time. So that would be 24 hours of
right, so would it be content-based? Right. Yeah. If you look at the 16304, the idea of evidence or potential evidentiary value, I'm going to be the first to tell you, admittedly, there's going to be some judgment, especially when you're talking about potential evidentiary value, right? Because what you're going to have to do is sort of look a little bit in a crystal ball at what might come up and what video you've got that might be relevant to it. So for sure, if you're starting to hear rumors about one of your bus drivers having inappropriate contact with riders, at least that bus driver's video, for as far back as you can grab it, is probably something you're going to want to hang on to. Do you need to hold on to the other 49? Yeah, maybe not. It's going to be situational, I think, very much so. The key, I think, for you guys in terms of staying on the right side of the rules of professional conduct is what you're telling the client, because especially with individual clients, they're going to come in and you're going to go through the spiel we just did, right? Are you using social media? And the first thing they're going to say is that going to be a problem? Well, I don't know. Let's see what you got. And then you look and you're like, holy Jesus, right? And they can gauge that reaction well enough to know that you think that's a problem. And so then you turn to them and you say, we're going to have to preserve this. And they say, gotcha. right? And then they run home and they destroy it all, right? But you're going to have sent them a letter telling them not to do that. And then you're on the right side of the rules of professional conduct. They're on the hook for spoliation, which you also told them about. I mean, you can't prevent them from doing that if that's what they decide to do. You can only advise them, just like you advise them in other things. Clients sometimes do things against your better wishes and advice, and then they suffer the consequences, but you don't have a problem with our office when that happens, right? The other thing I would suggest to you is you have an obligation to probably start using routine, so those of you who are doing litigation, routine questions in your interrogatories and requests for production, asking the other side about its social media use. I think you've got to ask them, what social media platforms are you on? If you're really bold, I suppose you can ask them for their passwords. They're probably going to object and you'll get into a discovery dispute. But I think you've got to start asking. And even without asking, I think you probably should spend some time researching the social media use of both your client and the other side to see what they're up to. Because it's what this gentleman said, you'll find all kinds of interesting things. You know, the old days when the dark tinted van would drive up, right, for the workers' comp claim and they would be videoing, right? Well, that's what social media is now. So when the workers' comp guy who said his back was destroyed is climbing on the roof and, you know, swinging kettlebells, and those videos came out, right? Well, now it's what they're posting on social media when they're out on the jet ski on the weekend on the lake, and yet they're supposed to have an impossible back, right? So I think you got to start working on the social media piece. Other trend, and this is also an ABA recent addition, and is now before our Code of Professional Conduct Committee, but I don't think they proposed a rule yet, but you should keep an eye out for it because you might have some thoughts about this. Let me ask you, as the rules currently stand, anybody know what 16-300 says? I'm sure you all spend your days reading the rules of professional conduct just like I do. You know? What 16-300 says, and that's fine if you don't, right? Because it's a very, it's unusual that that rule ever comes up. 16-300 is a fairly narrow rule that says it's a violation of the rules of professional conduct for a lawyer to engage in discriminatory animus if they're before a tribunal representing a client, right? So no discrimination while representing a client before a tribunal. Fairly narrow? Right? So if you display discriminatory animus right now today, are you before a tribunal? No. And so that would be beyond the reach of a regulatory authority unless your discriminatory animus also violated another rule. So if one of you went up and inappropriately touched somebody, right, that's a battery. There's a rule that says no criminal conduct. Maybe we got something there. But if it's just boorish behavior that does not involve physical contact, under that rule, unless it's before a tribunal, it's difficult for our office to reach out and actually have jurisdiction. Now, if there's an ongoing pattern and it's part of a harassment and all of that stuff, maybe we can get there under 16-404. But the one-off, not so much. Yeah.
I have a question. For purposes of that rule, do you count quasi-judicial bodies as being tribunals?
You have to read the commentary. It does talk about tribunals being anything that you appear in front of that has sort of a decision-making authority. So I think the answer is yes. Now, the ABA proposed a change to that rule. There's about 28 states that have a rule that's either a little broader or some even narrower than that, but there's about 28 states that have, for lack of a better term, an anti-discrimination rule. And the ABA decided in the 21st century, lawyers should not behave that way, right? In any context, when you're being a lawyer, you should not behave in a discriminatory fashion. And so the rule that they propose that's being pushed out to the jurisdictions now is called 8.4G. What 8.4G, in our scheme, it would be 16-804G. What 16-804G, if it was adopted, or 8.4G provides is that it's violation of the rules of professional conduct for a lawyer to engage in discriminatory animus. And it's the typical categories, right? Gender, race, gender including sexual harassment, national origin, sexual orientation, all of that stuff, right? It's a violation of the rules of professional conduct to engage in discriminatory animus against a protected group or a protected individual in connection with the practice of law. What do you think that means? In connection with the practice of law. So let me ask you this. Some of you have staff? No, you guys all do this on your own. Good for you. Yes, some of you have staff. All right. and so if you had a staff member who was African American and went into the office one day and made a racially charged joke or spouted racial epithets at your associate or assistant or staff member, is that in connection with the practice of law? You say yes. How about this? Any of you go to the State Bar Annual Convention ever? No? Have you? I know you do, Bob, right? I know Bob from that side, right? So you should not interpret anything that I know Bob. But Bob goes to the State Bar Annual Convention. He's a former State Bar president, right? So at the State Bar Annual Convention, and I go to the State Bar Annual Convention, if I tell a racially charged joke, or if I go and I engage in some sort of sexually harassing behavior with someone, is that in connection with the practice of law? I'm at the president's reception. Is that in connection with the practice of law? I would tell you that the commentary to 8.4G says both of those are within the practice of law. So they specifically call out that in connection with the practice of law includes where lawyers have gathered for social purposes in connection with other lawyer stuff, whatever that means, right? So that includes the State Bar Annual Convention, the State Bar Reception. They got a lot of pushback when they proposed that rule at the national level at the ABA. We're not morality police, all of that stuff. And I think the idea from the ABA standpoint was lawyers shouldn't act that way in the 21st century. I don't know what that looks like enforcement-wise, because I can see a lot of he said, she said allegations, but you should be on the look for that rule because that's one that the Code of Professional Conduct Committee is considering. Did you have a question, sir? You do not. All right, good. Well, not good that you don't have a question. You're welcome to ask a question anytime. All right, another rule that's currently pending. How many of you are in solo practice? And I only raise that because it's a rule that the solo practitioners have paid more attention to, but it's not directed at the solo practitioner. It's a mandatory succession planning rule. And that's the idea that lawyers have got to take some thought and planning into what happens to their clients if they have to stop practicing unexpectedly for whatever reason, right? So there's an incapacity issue, they die, they have a physical or mental issue, whatever the issue might be. For the past 3 or 4 years, the Succession and Transitioning Committee has built a fairly robust set of documents, if you go out to the State Bar website, that'll help lawyers plan their succession plan. But now Iowa has a mandatory rule. There's a couple other states, including New Mexico, that are looking at a mandatory rule. And it will require a lawyer to have a written plan what will happen in the event they become incapacitated or die. Now, if you die, chances are you're not going to come back to work, right? You can laugh at that. Are you going to come back to work if you're dead? Probably not. But what you're going to do is have some instruction on where your case files are at. What is a current client inventory list? Where are your accounts held? And that your assisting attorney, the person who's going to step in and help, and in a case of death, probably distribute your practice, how they can get access to computer passwords and all of that kind of stuff. That can be the simplest estate plan, and that's compliant with the proposed rule. And then some lawyers will take much more elaborate using those forms that we talked about. And they'll have powers of attorney, and you know, if you think about it, if you are only going to be out for 3 or 6 months, maybe you want to come back to your practice, maybe somebody helps keep the balls in the air, subject to the client's consent, they'll actually run the practice for you. Somewhere in between there might be what you want. But mandatory succession planning is at least something before the court, and I think they're going to, it was an out-of-cycle rule request, so I think they're going to act on it within the next 3 weeks. And then we'll push out some more information, and there'll be what I call a soft enforcement to start with, which is just reminding you of what you need to do, helping you get it set up if you want the help, that kind of stuff. Yes, sir?
I hate to even ask this, but what's the penalty?
What's the penalty? Yeah. I don't know yet, right? If you die, we're going to dig you up and disbar you, right? No, and that's a legitimate question. What's the penalty? I would tell you that I think that goes more into the concept of, while it's a mandatory rule, it's more in that proactive nature, right, of trying to get lawyers to do something. And so, especially with the initial enforcement, if you will. It's going to be, do you have a succession plan? No. All right, let's schedule a time when we can help you get one in place, right? And then you just have to keep it up. And that's it, you're done, right? There's no need for anybody to try to dig you up when you're dead and disbar you, right? Because our jurisdiction would end at that point. So, and if you think about it, it's the same kind of concept behind 16104C. 16104C is the rule that says you have to tell clients if you don't have minimum malpractice insurance, right? 100, 300,000. And we'll ask you about that in our office, and most of the time what we hear back from lawyers is yes, I have it, or no, I don't, or here's what it looks like. When I give the client the acknowledgement, every now and then a lawyer will say, no, I don't, and we ask them to get it remediated immediately, and they usually do, right? But the better thing about 16104C is, according to the Lawyers Professional Liability Committee, is the incident of uninsured lawyers has dropped dramatically in New Mexico because it's made lawyers aware of the idea that I need to think about malpractice insurance, right, for my client's benefit. Same kind of thing with succession planning. My hope is it makes lawyers start thinking about it, which means then they start doing it. Now, a couple more issues and then whatever questions you guys have. I've got some handouts if you want them. They're not required. But one of the other issues that is hot nationally, and it ties into the regulatory system, I think, in a way that might make sense to you. For years, I've heard that lawyers drink a lot and use a lot of substance abuse and are depressed. Maybe, right? Except about 2 years ago, Hazelton Betty Ford, and I won't ask any of you to tell me if you're familiar with it. Hazelton Betty Ford is Betty Ford, the wife of the former president, who had some addiction issues and formed this, this rehabilitation clinic, basically. Well, now they do a lot more, including studies, and I was privileged enough to I know one of the guys who did this study, and about middle of 2016, they came out with their results. And what they did is they surveyed lawyers nationally to determine drinking, substance abuse, and mental health. And what do you think they found? So we're not talking anecdotal anymore. This is actual evidence. What do you think they found? That we have no problem? No, we have a big problem, right? 2 to 3 times the average of people who aren't lawyers in substance abuse, problematic drinking, including alcoholism, and clinical depression. I suspect that one's a little bit underreported because there's a huge stigma associated with all of those. But I've found that mental health in particular, people are very uncomfortable talking about, especially if they feel like it's them. And as a result of that, there was a national task force that was formed, which I'm honored to be one of the current co-chairs. I was a member when the report was written, but there's a report out about things that the bar as a whole, and law schools, and courts, and regulators, and everybody can do to address the issue. I would tell you that it's not uncommon for a lawyer who finds themselves in regulatory entanglement to have some other underlying issue that's going on. And we don't go poking around for it, it just sort of bubbles to the surface sometimes. And so working with things like JLAP, which we have in New Mexico, to address those issues is important because it gets back to that promoting the public interest concept. If you get a good lawyer back in service when they're struggling, before they get into a lot of disciplinary trouble, that's better for everybody. And I try to remind lawyers it's not a violation of the rules in and of itself to be an alcoholic, a substance addict, or depressed, right? What happens is when the lawyer doesn't get the help they need and treat that, then they get into some of the violations of the rules of professional conduct that then cause them to have consequences, sometimes which I can't help. If you don't know this, JLAP has now increased its funding significantly. And JLAP has an employee assistance program that's available to all of you and to your families and to your staff. And you can get 4 clinical visits, basically, as I understand it, with licensed therapists if you're having some issues. And then if it needs to go beyond, and that's free, right? And it's per issue. So it might be this month you're having one issue and maybe 3 months from now you've got something else you need to talk to them about. But if it goes past 4, they'll work with your insurance company, the provider. And this is statewide. And it's brand new under the new executive director who's got some funding to do it. It's a wonderful program, right? And my encouragement to you is if at any point you feel the need for it, just reach out. It's confidential. Don't worry about the stigmatization. I will never hear about it. If you don't have discipline trouble, nobody's going to tell me that you contacted them, and I'm glad because I don't want to know, right? Or if you know somebody else, one of your colleagues who's struggling, talk to them about this, right? Because if they get help, that's better than them getting discipline, right? And then the last thing I think we're going to talk about is access to justice, right? Probably you've heard that there's a significant access to justice problem nationwide. Washington State did a study a couple of years ago. 75% of people who need lawyers do not have lawyers. And if you talk to the bigger jurisdictions, judicial districts here, first I'm sure would say this is true. I know this is true in second. In second, I think something along the lines of in 50% of their DR cases, family law cases, there's one party unrepresented. And actually maybe it's 50% both parties are pro se, and in 75% one of them is unrepresented. So, I mean, that's huge, right? And especially if anybody does DR work and you're working against a pro se party, that can be difficult because they're unfamiliar with the system, they're already spinning because their life's coming out of control. I'll tell you, if you're a family law practitioner, you're more likely to get a disciplinary complaint, and that's true nationally, not a meritorious one. It's just people in that kind of crisis are swinging around at everybody, right? And there are a lot of complaints we get about the lawyer, about the other lawyer, about the judge, about the hearing officer. And so those are people who by and large are already upset and now they're unfamiliar with the system and they feel like they're getting crushed by the system. So access to justice, I know, has become an initiative for our Supreme Court. In fact, they're looking at concepts that include alternative license structures, right? So that you can have, similar to the medical profession, trained, licensed individuals who can perform lower services, and I don't mean lower in the sense of a pejorative manner, I mean services that are a little less complicated, that might be more affordable, and help with some of that access to justice issue, and also take some of that crushing docket away from most of our district courts. So you should keep your eye out for that in the next year, because I think that's going to really take off in the next year or so. You guys have questions? You just want to go home, right? All right, well, thanks for your attention.
Thank you, everyone. Our conference is now over. Please do remember to fill out your CLE forms. I do need those to submit your CLEs, and please do an evaluation as well and leave them out front. We'll collect them. Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah, and I found that's much better than trying to do the copy.